The first body didn't look like a crime scene. That was the problem. Detective Sergeant Ren Kagatsu had worked the Yokohama underbelt for 11 years, long enough to know what a Quirk killing looked like from 30 feet away, and long enough to know this wasn't one. No scorch pattern, no impact crater, no telltale signature of a villain's ability stamped into the concrete like a brand. Just a man slumped against the loading dock of an abandoned parts warehouse, mouth open in an expression that wasn't quite a scream, and wasn't quite a smile, skin gone the color of old paper. Kagatsu crouched beside him, careful not to touch anything before forensics arrived, and studied the throat. 2 small punctures, precise as a surgeon's incision, already closing at the edges like the body itself was trying to erase the evidence. "No blood," said the officer beside him, a younger cop named Osei, who still flinched at scenes like this. "There's none on the ground, none on him. Where'd it go?" Kagatsu didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. He pulled out his phone and made the call he always dreaded making, the one that meant paperwork stacked 6 inches high, and a captain who'd ask him for a Quirk classification he didn't have. "This one's not ours," he said when the desk picked up. "Get me Tsukauchi, 3 miles east, in a sub-level beneath a shuttered pachinko parlor that had never once shown a profit on its official books. The real business of the Yokohama underbelt continued as it always did, quietly, carefully, and entirely without permits. The room smelled of solder and cheap incense, an attempt to mask the ozone stink of illegal support item modification. 6 men worked in the low light around a device that looked like a satellite dish crossed with a jet engine's turbine core, its housing cracked open to expose wiring that pulsed faintly violet, out of sync with itself. "It's not stable," said the tech running point, a wiry man everyone called Sabu because nobody used real names down here. "The output keeps drifting. If we push it past 60% again, it's going to..." "Push it," said the man paying for all of it. He went by Handa in this room, though that wasn't his name either, and his money came from a buyer with deep pockets and no patience for delays. "A buyer connected," whispered Sabu's crew when Handa wasn't listening, to the Shie Hasaikai. Overhaul's people wanted a working teleportation device that didn't rely on borrowing Kurogiri's goodwill, and they wanted it before the League of Villains' patience for shared resources ran out. Sabu didn't like it. The device was built from black market blueprints, stitched together from 4 different stolen Quirk analysis reports. None of them meant to work in combination, and every simulation kept spitting back the same warning before it crashed. "Unstable aperture. Containment not guaranteed." 65%, Sabu said, watching the dial climb. 68. The turbine core screamed. Not a mechanical sound. Something underneath it. A frequency that made every man in the room feel it behind his eyes, rather than hear it in his ears. The violet wiring flared white, then black, then tore. For less than 4 seconds, the air in the center of the room split open like wet fabric, a ragged vertical seam of nothing that swallowed the overhead light and gave nothing back. Something stepped through it. Sabu would spend what remained of his life, considerably less time than he expected, though he didn't know that yet, trying to describe what he saw in that half-second before the tear sealed itself with a sound like a held breath finally released. A man, he'd say, if anyone ever asked him again, which they wouldn't. A tall man in white, standing in the wreckage of their machine like he'd simply walked through a door that had always been there. Dust and sparking wire settling around him, without ever touching the fabric of his coat. Honda recovered first, because Handa was the kind of man who'd survived long enough in this business by never hesitating. "Who the hell are you?" he said, already reaching for the weapon holstered at his hip, an illegal Quirk nullifying dart gun that had cost him 3 months' profit. "How'd you get in here?" The man in white turned his head. His eyes were the wrong color, a deep, saturated red that seemed to pull the low light of the room toward it rather than reflect it. with pupils that had narrowed to thin vertical slits, like something that belonged in water instead of air. "That," he said, in a voice that carried no particular urgency, "is a question I intend to answer for myself before I answer it for you." Handa fired. The dart crossed the distance in under a second, a specialized round designed to disrupt a Quirk's active output on contact, effective against nearly anything the Underbelt's clientele had ever thrown at each other. It struck the man in white square in the chest. Nothing happened. Not nothing in the sense of a shield or a barrier flaring to stop it. Nothing in the sense that the dart simply failed to matter, its payload discharging into flesh that did not so much as acknowledge the intrusion. No ripple of suppressed ability. No flicker of a Quirk being switched off, because there was no Quirk there to switch off in the first place. The man in white looked down at the dart still lodged in his coat, unbothered, the way a person might look at a mosquito that had landed and not yet bitten. "How disappointing," he said, and closed the distance between himself and Handa in a way that none of the 5 other men in that basement ever fully processed. Not a blur, not a burst of speed with a visible trail behind it, simply there, and then simply closer, as if the space between 2 points had quietly agreed to shorten itself. Handa didn't scream. He didn't have time to. His body went rigid, then loose, and folded to the concrete floor without a mark on him that any of the others could see in the chaos of the moment. Though Sabu, backed against the ruined turbine housing with his hands raised and his bladder failing him, saw the 2 small wounds at the throat before the lights above them flickered and died entirely. "The rest of you," said the voice in the dark, calm and almost bored, "will tell me where I am, precisely, and you will not waste my patience deciding whether to lie." 3 of the 6 men in that basement were dead within 90 seconds. Sabu was not one of them, though he would spend every day of the 11 days remaining to him wishing that he had been. What Muzan Kibutsuji understood, standing in the wreckage of a machine he had not built and did not fully comprehend, was this: he was no longer where he had been. He had lived, if lived was the word, which he privately doubted applied to him any longer, for well over 1,000 years with a single unbroken continuity of threat and countermeasure. The Demon Slayer Corps, its sword forms and its breathing techniques, its Hashira who could, on their best day, land a blow that mattered. Wisteria, sunlight, the narrow, exhausting list of things capable of ending him, memorized down to the smallest exception, guarded against with the same obsessive precision he applied to everything. None of that list applied here. He determined this within the first quarter hour, working through the trembling underbelt worker, the small one, the one who smelled of solder and terror in equal measure, with the patient, surgical questioning that had kept him alive across a millennium of hunters. Not violence first. Violence was inefficient. Information first, always, and violence only once the information had been extracted and the informant's usefulness exhausted. Quirks, the boy called them, powers that ran in blood, inherited, categorized, licensed, displayed on identification cards like a criminal record or a professional credential, depending on which side of the law you stood. A society that had rebuilt itself entirely around the existence of the abnormal until the abnormal became the baseline and normalcy became the rarity worth remarking on. Muzan found this, in the detached corner of his mind that observed rather than felt, almost elegant, a world where everyone carried some sliver of the impossible already. A world where he would not have to hide the fact of his own impossibility so much as find the correct shape to hide it in. The dart still sat lodged in the fabric of his coat. He removed it between 2 fingers, examined the mechanism with clinical interest, and set it down on the workbench beside the ruined machine. "This," he said to the trembling boy, holding up the spent cartridge, "was meant to strip me of some manner of ability." "Explain." The boy explained. in the stammering, overfast way of someone who had already watched enough of his colleagues die to understand that hesitation carried its own cost. Quirk nullification. Erasure. A hero. A specific one, apparently well known in this district. A man with red eyes and a scarf who could switch off another person's quirk with a look, so long as he kept looking. Suppression cuffs. Trigger drugs that could force a quirk beyond its natural limits. An entire vocabulary of containment built, evidently, around the assumption that whatever ability a person carried could, with the correct tool, be turned off. Muzan considered this for a long moment, turning the dead cartridge over in his six-fingered hand. He had encountered creatures throughout his long, unnatural life who believed they understood the totality of what could and could not be suppressed. He had, on more than one occasion, allowed such creatures to continue believing that belief for exactly as long as it amused him. "They will find," he said, mostly to himself, "that I am not the sort of thing their instruments were built to measure." He let the boy live. Not from mercy. Mercy was a concept Muzan regarded the way most men regarded a decorative object, pleasant to look at, and entirely without use, but because a living source of information, properly frightened, was worth more in the coming days than one more body, for whatever authority in this world investigated such things. He gave Sabu a single instruction before he left the ruined basement, delivered without inflection, the kind of order that did not require repeating. "Speak of tonight to no one who might act on it, and you may continue breathing. Speak of it to the wrong ears, and I will know." He did not explain how he would know. He rarely explained anything twice. By morning, Yokohama's black market district had absorbed the story the way it absorbed everything, quietly, without official acknowledgement, filtered down through whispered channels until it reached ears that mattered more than a beat cop's report. 3 underbelt operators dead with no quirk signature at the scene. A 4th vanished. A 5th left catatonic in a way the district's usual chemical enhancers didn't explain. The Shie Hasaikai heard about it before the Hero Public Safety Commission did. That was how the underbelt worked. Official channels were always the last to know anything worth knowing. Kai Chisaki received the report in his private office above the Yakuza's front operation, seated at his desk with a fresh pair of surgical gloves already on despite having touched nothing all morning. He listened to Rappa's summary, delivered in Rappa's usual manner, more enthusiasm than precision, and then to the corrected, more careful version Hekiji Tengai gave afterward. Stone-textured arms crossed, gravel voice flat with the particular caution he reserved for things that didn't fit a category. "No quirk signature," Chisaki repeated, turning the words over like something he wanted to disinfect before accepting them as true. "That's not possible. Every disruption leaves a trace. Even erasure leaves a trace." "Not this one," Tengai said. "Whatever it was, it walked through Honda's dart like it wasn't there, and it left 3 men without a mark and without blood." Chisaki was quiet for a moment, his masked face unreadable, his mind already working through the possibilities the way it worked through every problem, as a matter of components, of parts that could be understood, isolated, and if necessary, taken apart to see what made them function. "Find it," he said finally, "before the heroes do, before Shigaraki's people do. If there is something in this city capable of killing without leaving evidence a quirk detection scan can register, I want to know what it is, and I want to know whether it can be." He paused, choosing the word with the same precision he chose everything. "Replicated." Rappa grinned, cracking his knuckles with visible eagerness. "And if it doesn't want to be found, then we make it regret staying hidden," Chisaki said, and went back to his files, already certain, in the quiet arrogance of a man who had never yet met a power he couldn't eventually deconstruct, that whatever had killed those 3 men in that basement was simply another problem waiting for the correct set of hands. He would not remain certain of that for very much longer. Naomasa Tsukauchi arrived at the scene 4 hours after Kagatsu's call, stepping carefully around the chalk outline of a body that had, according to the initial report, shown no blood loss consistent with the wounds on its throat. He crouched where Kagatsu had crouched the night before, studying the same closing punctures, the same paper-pale skin. "Any quirk match?" he asked. "Nothing," Kagatsu said. "Ran it against every known blood drain, blood manipulation, and puncture-based quirk on file. Closest match is maybe 40%, and 40% isn't a match, it's a coincidence." Tsukauchi's quirk let him know, with total certainty, when a person spoke a lie. It told him nothing at all about a mystery this quiet. No suspect to question, no confession to weigh, just a body that raised more questions than the department had answers for. He stood, brushing dust from his knees, and looked out at the warehouse district stretching away into the gray morning haze, thinking, not for the first time in his long career, that some cases announced themselves from the very first hour as the kind that would not end quickly. "Get me everything from the surrounding blocks," he said. "Cameras, informants, anyone who heard anything unusual last night. And Kagatsu, don't file this as a standard quirk homicide yet. Not until we know what we're actually looking at." Kagatsu nodded, already dreading the paperwork that admission would require, and did not yet know how right his instinct had been to call this one in without a category to put it in. 3 blocks away, in a rented room above a noodle shop that would not remember his face by the following week, Muzan Kibutsuji sat by a window with the curtains drawn against the pale morning light, and began, with the same unhurried patience he had once applied to a hunt that spanned centuries, to learn the shape of the world he now intended to own. The noodle shop below Muzan's rented room served broth from 4 in the morning until well past midnight, and the owner, a stooped, incurious woman named Etsuko, who had survived 3 decades in this district by asking no questions of anyone who paid in cash, never once suspected that the quiet, impeccably dressed tenant in room 4 hadn't eaten a bite of her cooking in the 6 days he'd occupied it. 6 days. Muzan measured them the way he measured everything, in increments of information gathered and threats catalogued, and by the close of the 6th he had assembled a working understanding of this world that would have taken a lesser mind considerably longer. He had, first, confirmed the boy's account of quirks by observing them directly, a delivery man on the street below whose arms elongated to absurd lengths to reach a dropped package before it struck the pavement, a child no older than 7, who left small scorch flowers blooming across the sidewalk with every excited stomp of her feet, a woman whose eyes glowed faintly gold as she navigated the crowded street by some sense that clearly wasn't ordinary sight. Every person he observed carried some sliver of the abnormal, as unremarkably as they carried a wallet. It confirmed what the trembling boy had told him, and went further. This was not a world hiding its monsters. This was a world that had simply redefined the word until it stopped applying to anyone at all. Which meant, Muzan understood with the particular cold satisfaction of a predator recognizing ideal terrain, that his own abnormality would need to clear a considerably higher bar before anyone here thought to be afraid of it. He had also, in that same 6 days, tested the boundaries of what this world's tools could do to him, carefully, without spectacle, the way he tested everything. He purchased, through Sabu's continued and thoroughly terrified cooperation, a set of what the underbelt called suppressant cuffs, restraint gear built to dampen a quirk's active output when clamped around a wrist. He allowed Sabu to fasten them, out of clinical curiosity rather than necessity, and felt nothing. No dampening, no resistance, no sense of some internal switch being reached for and finding no switch to reach. The cuffs simply closed around flesh that had never operated on the principle they were built to interrupt. "Interesting," he'd said, examining the cuffs before removing them with no more effort than untying a ribbon. Your world has built an entire architecture of control around the assumption that ability originates from a single, uniform source. Bloodline. Mutation. Genetics made strange. He'd set the cuffs down, unbroken, beside the empty bowl Etsuko had left outside his door out of habit, rather than any expectation he'd touch it. Mine did not come from blood. It came from something considerably older, and considerably more thorough. He did not elaborate to Sabu what that something was. The blood of a demon god, forced into a dying man a millennium ago, refined and perfected across 1,000 years of consumption and adaptation, until what remained bore no more resemblance to a quirk than a hurricane bore to a human breath. He had no interest in explaining himself to a tool, but he filed the confirmation away with satisfaction. This world's every mechanism for controlling its abnormal population was built on a foundation his own nature simply did not touch. The one variable that gave him genuine pause, genuine in the sense that Muzan allowed himself pause for perhaps 4 things in a millennium, was the detection systems. Sabu, still hoping each answered question might buy another day of breathing, had described a network of Quirk registry databases, ID cards embedded with detection chips, and specialized scanning technology used by the Hero Public Safety Commission to catalog and classify every ability in the country. Muzan had no ID card. He would register on none of their systems as anything at all, not merely unlisted, but structurally illegible to a network built to read a signature he simply didn't emit. He turned this fact over for a long while, seated by the window with the curtains drawn, watching the ordinary chaos of a Tuesday afternoon in Yokohama's back streets. Illegible could mean invisible. It could also mean flagged. A society this obsessive about classification would not, he suspected, respond well to something that broke its cataloging on first contact. An anomaly that couldn't be filed would draw exactly the kind of attention he'd spent 1,000 years teaching himself to avoid. He would need, he decided, a face. Several faces, in fact. The same old strategy that had kept him ahead of the Demon Slayer Corps for 100 lifetimes, repurposed now for a different hunt. A society built on visible difference offered, paradoxically, an excellent place to hide, provided a man chose his difference carefully and never let it become the interesting kind. The interesting kind found him anyway, 4 days later, in the form of 3 men who did not belong to Sabu's crew. They came to the noodle shop just past closing, when Etsuko had already flipped her sign and begun stacking chairs, and they moved with the unhurried confidence of men who had never once, in their professional lives, walked into a room they didn't already own. Muzan watched them from the top of the stairs before they'd finished announcing themselves to Etsuko, watched the way they filled the doorway, watched the particular quality of stillness in the largest of the 3, a towering man with a shaved head and knuckles scraped raw from habitual use, and understood immediately that these were not underbelt street muscle. These were something with an actual chain of command behind them. "We're looking for a tenant," said the smallest of the 3, a thin man with an unnervingly calm voice, standing slightly behind the others in the manner of someone accustomed to letting bigger men absorb the first risk of a room. "White coat, doesn't eat. Killed 3 men in a basement 6 days ago without leaving so much as a bruise pattern behind." Etsuko, to her considerable credit and Muzan's mild private amusement, said nothing at all, only stared at the men with the flat incomprehension of a woman who had genuinely never once looked closely enough at her tenants to notice such details. Muzan descended the stairs before the question could be pressed further, because he had already decided, in the time it took the large one to crack his knuckles, that letting this conversation continue below in front of Etsuko carried more risk than concluding it himself. "You're looking for me," he said, arriving at the bottom step with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything. "I'd ask how you found this address, but I suspect the answer involves a great deal of money changing hands with people who shouldn't have taken it." The large one, Rappa, though Muzan didn't yet have the name, grinned with genuine delight, the particular delight of a man who lived for exactly this kind of moment. Boss wants to talk, real polite-like, if you come easy. Considerably less polite if you don't.
And your boss is?
Somebody who doesn't like things he can't categorize, said the stone-skinned one, arms crossed, voice like gravel dragged over concrete. You qualify. Muzan studied the three of them with the same clinical patience he'd once reserved for assessing a Hashira's fighting stance. Not fear, never fear, but the calculating pleasure of a creature sizing up whether a fight was worth the noise it would generate. Three underlings. A boss with resources sufficient to trace his address within a week of arriving in an unfamiliar world. An organization interested enough to send muscle rather than police. This was, he decided, more useful than dangerous. A conversation conducted on his terms could tell him a great deal about the actual power structures of this world, considerably more than another 6 days of careful street observation would. I'll come, he said, not because you've compelled me to, because I find myself curious what a man who sends 3 men to fetch a stranger considers worth categorizing. He glanced back once at Etsuko, who had gone very still behind her counter. The woman had nothing to do with any of this. I'd prefer she remain able to say so, honestly, if anyone asks her later. It wasn't Mercy. Rappa and Tengai wouldn't have recognized Mercy if it introduced itself by name, and they didn't try to. But something in the flat, absolute certainty of the statement, not a request, not a threat, simply a fact being stated about how the next several minutes would proceed, made even Rappa's grin falter for half a second, before he shrugged it off and gestured toward the door. The Shie Hasaikai's true headquarters lay beneath a shuttered clinic 3 districts over, accessed through a service elevator that dropped considerably farther than the building's modest exterior suggested. Muzan noted the design with something close to approval as they descended. Layered security, restricted access points, the architecture of an organization that understood the value of being difficult to find. He had built similar structures himself, once, across a very different kind of underworld. Kai Chisaki received him in an office kept scrupulously, almost obsessively clean, every surface wiped to a shine that reflected the room's harsh overhead lighting. Chisaki did not stand when Muzan entered, did not offer a hand, gloved, Muzan noted, along with the surgical mask, an evident fixation on contamination that told him a great deal about the kind of mind he was dealing with before a single word passed between them. You killed 3 of my associates' contacts, Chisaki said without preamble, seated behind a desk with his hands folded atop a closed file. Efficiently, without leaving the kind of trace my sources are equipped to identify. That interests me, considerably more than it angers me, which is the only reason you're sitting across from me and not currently being processed by Rappa. Your associate's contacts drew a weapon on me in a room I hadn't asked to enter, Muzan said, seating himself in the offered chair with unhurried precision, adjusting nothing about his posture that didn't need adjusting. I found their hospitality lacking. I'm told the weapon was a Quirk nullifying dart, standard issue for underbelt security. It didn't register on you at all. Chisaki's eyes, the only visible part of his face above the mask, studied Muzan with the particular intensity of a man already 3 steps into deconstructing a problem. That's not supposed to be possible. Every ability in this world responds to nullification on some level, even the ones that resist it. Yours didn't respond at all, which tells me one of 2 things. Either you don't have a quirk in any sense my scanners would recognize, or you have found some manner of shielding against nullification tools that I have never once encountered in 15 years of specializing in exactly this field. The first, Muzan said. Entirely the first. Then what are you? It wasn't posed as a question so much as a demand for inventory. the tone of a man accustomed to taking things apart to answer exactly this kind of query, and Muzan found himself, in the private, patient part of his mind, that had outlived 1,000 years of similar men asking similar questions, faintly entertained by the presumption. I am considerably older than anything your classification systems were built to accommodate, he said, and I have very little interest in being filed under a category that was never designed with me in mind. He let the silence sit a moment, studying Chisaki's masked, unreadable face with open curiosity of his own. You run this organization from beneath a false clinic. You collect quirks. If my information is accurate, extract them from the unwilling, redistribute them by design. An ambitious project for a man operating with such conventional tools. Something flickered behind Chisaki's eyes, not quite alarm, but the particular attentiveness of a man who had just heard a stranger describe his life's work with unsettling accuracy after 6 days in the country. You've done your research. I've done what any reasonable creature does upon arriving somewhere unfamiliar, Muzan said. I learned what could hurt me, and what I might use. He rose from the chair without waiting for permission. Unhurried, final. You want to know what I am, so you can determine whether I can be taken apart, and understood the way you take apart everything else that interests you. I'll save you the trouble of the attempt. I cannot. Rappa, standing near the door, shifted his weight, clearly hoping the conversation might yet resolve itself into something he'd enjoy considerably more. Chisaki did not rise, did not raise his voice, did not so much as unfold his hands from atop the file on his desk. I don't accept cannot as a permanent condition. Everything can be understood, given the correct tools and enough patience. I have both in abundance. Then I imagine we'll have further conversations, Muzan said, already turning toward the door, entirely unbothered by the implicit threat, the way a man might be unbothered by a child's insistence that he could, in fact, win a fight against a mountain. I'd advise against sending your enforcers after me a second time without a considerably better plan than the first. I let 3 of your men live tonight, out of what I can only describe as curiosity. I don't extend that curiosity indefinitely. He left the way he'd come, Rappa and Tengai trailing him back to the service elevator with the particular wariness of men who'd been told, in no uncertain terms not spoken aloud, that they'd just witnessed something well above their pay grade to fully understand. Kai Chisaki remained at his desk long after the elevator doors closed, turning the encounter over with the same meticulous attention he gave to every unsolved problem, and reached, by the time dawn broke over the false clinic above him, a single working conclusion that would shape every decision he made regarding the stranger from here forward. Whatever this creature is, it does not fear me, it does not fear my organization, and it does not fear this world. I need to understand why before it decides it has no further use for any of us. 3 days after that meeting, the Hero Public Safety Commission received its first flagged report, not from Chisaki's organization, which had no interest in inviting official scrutiny into its own black market dealings, but from a routine cross-reference sweep of Yokohama's unresolved homicide files. 3 bodies. No Quirk signature match above 40% confidence on any registered ability. A pattern of throat wounds with no consistent classification. The report crossed the desk of a junior analyst who nearly filed it under routine gang violence before a footnote caught her attention. A note from Detective Tsukauchi's precinct requesting the case remain open pending further review. An unusual flag for a department that closed unsolved gang cases within the month as a matter of standard procedure. She forwarded it up the chain with a note of her own. Recommend Hero Liaison Review. Possible unregistered or unknown origin ability. Pattern inconsistent with any quirk on current database. It would take another 9 days for that recommendation to land on a desk with the authority to act on it, and by then, Muzan Kibutsuji would have already begun the next, more deliberate phase of learning this world's shape. Not from the underworld looking up, this time, but from somewhere considerably closer to its heroes. The decision to walk toward the heroes rather than away from them was not, Muzan reflected, a decision most creatures in his position would have made. Most things that survived as long as he had survived did so through avoidance. 1,000 years of choosing distance over confrontation, obscurity over exposure, the quiet countryside town over the capital's crowded streets. But avoidance had only ever been a strategy in service of a longer goal, never a virtue in itself. And Muzan had learned enough in his first 2 weeks in this world to understand that its heroes were not the Demon Slayer Corps. They didn't hunt in secret. They operated in daylight, with government funding and public adoration, and a bureaucracy that moved, by his estimation, with the particular sluggishness of any institution convinced of its own permanence. An institution like that could be studied at close range, far more easily than the fractured, secretive hunters he'd spent a millennium evading. He chose his face carefully for this phase, not the one Sabu and Etsuko and Chisaki's people had seen, but a new one, assembled with the same meticulous attention he'd once given to 100 prior identities. Older, this time. Distinguished, unremarkable, the kind of face that belonged behind a desk rather than in a headline. He gave himself a name suited to blend into corporate Tokyo without drawing a second glance, secured, through means that involved considerably less violence than his first weeks in this world, a modest position within a support item logistics firm that did legitimate, if unglamorous, business supplying hero agencies across the greater Yokohama-Tokyo corridor. It was, he found, an excellent vantage point. Invoices, delivery manifests, casual conversation with couriers who moved between agency offices and knew, in the offhand way of people who'd stopped being impressed by their own proximity to celebrity, which heroes ran which operations, which agencies were expanding, which were quietly struggling, which up-and-coming names the Commission had begun watching with particular interest. He learned, within his first month in this new guise, the rough architecture of the system, a hero public safety commission that set policy and licensed the entire profession from above, individual agencies beneath it, ranked by public approval and case resolution statistics into a hierarchy that shifted every quarter. A training pipeline running through specialized academies, chief among them a school called UA whose name came up in courier conversation, with a frequency that told him everything about its actual importance, long before anyone stated it outright. He learned about the League of Villains, too, fragments at first, rumors traded between couriers who'd delivered to agencies investigating a string of unclaimed incidents, then more substantial detail once he began, with patient and deliberate care, cultivating a low-level informant within the firm's own security division, who had, it turned out, a gambling debt considerably larger than his salary could cover. A man named Shigaraki, a warp quirk user called Kurogiri, who served as the group's transportation, and from what little the informant knew, something like its quiet anchor. An organization the Commission treated as a serious ongoing threat, rather than the disorganized street-level nuisance its early public coverage had suggested. Muzan filed all of it away with the same patient thoroughness he'd once applied to memorizing every Hashira's fighting style, every breathing technique's known counter, every village the Demon Slayer Corps had ever used as a staging ground. Information, in his considerable experience, was worth more than strength in the opening moves of any long game. Strength could be demonstrated later, at a time and place of his choosing. Information, gathered wrong or too late, could not be recovered at all. It was in his 6th week in this new identity, a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for what it would come to mean, that Muzan first laid eyes on a pro-hero in the field. He had reason to be near the scene, a legitimate delivery of support item components to a mid-tier agency office, the kind of routine task his cover position required him to oversee periodically to maintain its plausibility. He was crossing the street outside the agency's loading dock when the alarm sounded 3 blocks over. Not a siren exactly, but a cascading alert tone that every phone on the street seemed to receive in the same instant, followed by the particular ripple of civilian reaction that told him, even before he understood the specifics, that something dangerous had just announced itself nearby. He did not run. Running drew attention, and attention was the one thing his current guise could least afford. He walked, unhurried, in the general direction of the commotion, blending into the loose current of onlookers who gathered at a respectful distance behind hastily erected barriers, phones raised, faces caught between fear and the particular hunger for spectacle that Muzan recognized, with some private amusement, as a constant of human nature regardless of which world housed it. 2 blocks down, a man with skin like cracked volcanic rock had erupted through the front of a convenience store, dragging a terrified clerk by the collar, shouting something about a debt and a betrayal that Muzan didn't bother parsing for details. Minor, uninteresting. What held his attention instead was the hero who arrived to answer it, a lean, perpetually tired-looking man in black tactical gear, a long white scarf wound in loose coils around his neck and shoulders, dropping from a rooftop with an economy of motion that told Muzan, before a single ability had been demonstrated, that this was not a man who fought for spectacle. Eraserhead, he'd heard the name in courier conversation, the hero whose quirk could switch off another person's ability with nothing more than a sustained look, provided he kept his eyes open and his focus fixed. The one hero, according to his informant's nervous gossip, that the League of Villains treated with genuine, calculated wariness. Muzan watched from the edge of the gathered crowd as Eraserhead's eyes flared red and the rock-skinned man's cracked, stone-textured arms, mid-swing, aimed at a support column he clearly intended to bring down on the terrified clerk, abruptly reverted to ordinary human flesh, soft and vulnerable, and entirely unprepared for the impact he'd built the swing around. The man crumpled from his own momentum, more surprised by his own arm than by the hero closing the distance to restrain him. It was, Muzan thought, watching with the clinical attention of a man auditing a rival's technique, an extraordinarily efficient ability. A single sustained look, and an opponent's greatest advantage simply ceased to exist. He understood, in that moment and with total clarity, precisely why this world's villains spoke of this particular hero with more caution than they extended to heroes with considerably flashier powers. He also understood, with the same clarity, that it would do absolutely nothing to him. He did not test this belief in the street that afternoon. Testing it would have meant drawing Eraserhead's attention directly onto himself, an enormously premature move this early in his understanding of the world's actual power structure. But he filed the confirmation away with quiet satisfaction nonetheless, watching the hero secure the subdued villain with the same detached efficiency he'd brought to disabling him, offering the frightened clerk a brief, perfunctory reassurance before the police arrived to take custody, and thought, a world that has built its entire concept of containment around a single kind of switch will one day meet something with no switch to find, and it will not know, in that first moment, how badly its confidence has failed it. He filed one more observation away before the crowd dispersed, and he resumed his unhurried walk back toward the agency's loading dock. The hero's exhaustion, the barely concealed fatigue in every motion, the sense of a man perpetually stretched thinner than his caseload allowed. This world's heroes were not gods. They were workers, bound to the same limits of endurance and attention as anyone else, propped up by a system that asked considerably more of them than it ever fully acknowledged. That, too, would prove useful, in time. The informant's gambling debt, as these arrangements tended to do, eventually outgrew what small favors and quiet cash payments could cover, and by the 8th week, Muzan found himself possessed of something considerably more valuable than logistics gossip. An actual name inside the Hero Public Safety Commission's mid-tier bureaucracy, a records clerk with access to classification files well above what a courier or a security guard would ever see. He did not approach her directly. Directness this early remained a poor investment. Instead, he arranged, through a chain of intermediaries thin enough that none of them could trace the request back to its true origin, for a modest anonymous consulting fee, to reach her in exchange for a single favor, a summary, general rather than specific, of how the Commission's classification system handled anomalies that failed to register on standard quirk detection scans. The answer, delivered 3 days later through the same careful chain, told him almost everything he needed to know. Unregistered anomalies are flagged for Hero Liaison Review upon confirmed pattern of 3 or more incidents. Review triggers a classification hearing, at which point the anomaly is assigned either provisional quirk status, pending genetic verification, or escalated to Commission Special Case Designation if genetic origin cannot be confirmed. Special Case Designation authorizes expanded investigative and containment resources, including provisional authority to deploy specialized capture and classification teams independent of standard agency jurisdiction. Muzan read the summary twice, seated in the modest, unremarkable apartment his cover identity maintained, and allowed himself something close to genuine satisfaction. 3 incidents. He had already provided them 3, in that basement 6 weeks prior, though those deaths remained, as far as his informant's summary indicated, still sitting in a queue, rather than an active hearing, buried under the ordinary bureaucratic sediment of a system that processed thousands of cases and prioritized none of them without cause. But the machinery had already begun turning. Somewhere in this city's vast administrative apparatus, a file existed with his true nature's fingerprints all over it, waiting for the moment enough attention converged to open it and take a proper look. He had, by his own estimation, perhaps a handful of months before that attention arrived. Less, if he grew careless. More, if he continued exercising the same patient discipline that had kept him ahead of the Demon Slayer Corps for 1,000 years. Time enough, either way, to decide precisely how he wanted this world's authorities to first understand what they were dealing with, on his terms rather than theirs. He thought, briefly, of Chisaki, of the man's cold, methodical certainty that anything could be understood given sufficient tools and patience, of the barely restrained ambition beneath that clinical exterior. An organization with resources, with an existing infrastructure for operating beneath the Commission's notice, with an apparent interest in acquiring exactly the kind of unclassifiable power Muzan represented. He thought, too, of the tired hero with the scarf, and the switch that would never find him, and the vast, unprepared confidence of a system built around assumptions his own existence simply refused to honor. There was, Muzan decided, watching the lights of Yokohama flicker on beyond his apartment window as evening settled over the city, a considerable amount of value remaining in patience. But patience, unlike distance, had never been an end unto itself. Somewhere in the weeks ahead, a first true demonstration would become necessary, not reckless, not born of carelessness, but deliberate, chosen, the first note in a much longer composition. He simply needed to decide, with the same unhurried care he brought to everything, exactly which audience deserved to hear it first. Kai Chisaki did not forget the man in white. Men who interested him rarely stayed forgotten for long, and this one had done something Chisaki considered nearly unforgivable in the 15 years he'd spent building his organization's understanding of quirks, mutation, and the biology of power. He had presented Chisaki with a puzzle Chisaki couldn't even properly define, let alone begin solving. He spent the 6 weeks following that first meeting doing what he did best: gathering, cataloging, cross-referencing. He put two of his more discreet associates on tracking the stranger's movements through the district, careful never to approach directly again after the first encounter's clear message. He learned, slowly and with mounting frustration, that the man had apparently secured legitimate employment under a different name and a subtly different face at a logistics firm, with contracts across half the hero agencies in the region, a detail that told Chisaki two things simultaneously. First, that whatever this creature was, it possessed a genuinely unsettling capacity to reshape its own appearance, which meant every description his people gathered might already be obsolete by the time it reached his desk. Second, and more troubling, that the creature was not hiding out of fear. It was positioning itself, learning the shape of a system with the same patient thoroughness Chisaki himself would have applied to a new acquisition. That kind of patience, in Chisaki's considerable experience, belonged only to two kinds of people, those with nothing to lose, and those already several moves ahead of everyone watching them. He raised the matter with Shigaraki through the League's usual indirect channels, not out of any particular loyalty to the alliance the Shie Hasaikai maintained with the League, which Chisaki privately regarded as more useful than trustworthy, but because a threat this unclassifiable, left unaddressed, had the potential to disrupt operations on both sides of that fragile arrangement. Kurogiri received the message and relayed it up through the League's own internal channels with the particular formal courtesy that made every interaction with him feel like doing business with an unusually polite ghost. Shigaraki's response, when it came, arrived through Kurogiri 3 days later, delivered in the Warp Quirk villain's characteristically measured tone, even second-hand. Tomura says, "If it's not attacking us, it's not our problem yet, but he wants to know if it can be recruited before it becomes someone else's asset." Chisaki found the response almost insultingly short-sighted, though he kept that opinion to himself, the way he kept most opinions about the League's leadership to himself. Shigaraki thought in terms of immediate utility: who could be turned, who could be broken, who could be thrown at All Might's legacy of heroes like a stone at a window. He did not think, the way Chisaki thought, in terms of what a thing actually was before deciding what to do with it. Recruitment assumed you understood enough about a creature's motivations to make it a genuine offer. Chisaki understood nothing about this man's motivations beyond a vague, unsettling sense that the stranger regarded the entire hero-villain conflict with the same faint amusement a man might show toward children arguing over a game whose rules he'd never bothered to learn. He decided, in the end, on a different approach than either Shigaraki's crude recruitment pitch or his own earlier attempt at direct confrontation. He would watch, he would gather, and when the moment came that the stranger's own actions forced a reaction from this world's authorities, and Chisaki was confident, given the pattern of the killings 6 weeks prior, that such a moment was coming, he would be positioned to see exactly what kind of response a being like that provoked, and exactly what weaknesses that response revealed. Patience, Chisaki reflected, adjusting the immaculate white glove on his right hand, was not a virtue he associated with villains as impulsive as Shigaraki. It was, however, the only strategy that had ever actually worked for him. The moment Chisaki was waiting for arrived not through any deliberate act of Muzan's, but through the ordinary, grinding machinery of bureaucracy finally catching up to itself. 9 weeks after the basement killings, the flagged report from the junior commission analyst reached the desk of a senior liaison officer named Fuyumi Hattori, a woman whose entire 20-year career had been built on a reputation for taking unclassifiable anomalies seriously, precisely because most of her colleagues didn't. She read the file twice. 3 deaths with no Quirk signature above 40% confidence, a pattern of throat wounds inconsistent with any registered ability, a request from a Yokohama detective to keep the case open well past the point standard procedure called for closure. She authorized a hero liaison review the same afternoon, and assigned the case, with the particular deliberate care of someone who understood the value of sending competence rather than seniority, to the agency handling the district's most consistent caseload of unusual incidents, Eraserhead's team, operating out of a modest UA-affiliated field office that Aizawa split between hero work and his teaching obligations. Aizawa read the file at his desk with the same flat, unimpressed expression he brought to most paperwork, until he reached the forensic photos of the throat wounds, at which point the expression sharpened into something more focused. "No blood at the scene," he said, more to himself than to the junior hero seated across from him, a recent UA graduate named Tsukasa doing rotation work under his supervision, eager in the particular way of someone still convinced fieldwork was more interesting than paperwork. Wounds like that should leave a mess. Instead, there's nothing. Some kind of absorption quirk, Tsukasa offered. Draining type abilities usually leave minimal external blood loss. Draining type still registers on a scan. This doesn't register at all. Aizawa flipped to the next page, scanning the 40% confidence match report with visible skepticism, and a 40% match to 3 different draining type quirks that don't otherwise resemble each other isn't a match. It's noise. He closed the file. "Get me everything from the district canvas. Every camera within 6 blocks of that warehouse. Every informant Kagatsu's precinct has ever used. If there's a person out there who did this and left no signature behind, I want to know what that even means before we go looking for them in the field." It was, Aizawa reflected privately, exactly the kind of case he least enjoyed. Not a straightforward villain with a known ability and a predictable pattern, but a genuine unknown, the sort of thing that got heroes killed precisely because they walked into it, expecting rules that turned out not to apply. Muzan learned of the review 3 days after it opened, through the same careful chain of intermediaries that had served him well for 2 months, and received the news with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, though the private, calculating part of his mind that had outlived 1,000 years of hunters recognized immediately that the timeline of his careful patience had just meaningfully compressed. A hero liaison review meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant an active investigator, presumably competent given the Commission's evident seriousness in assigning the case, working backward from 3 deaths toward a description, a pattern, eventually a face. His current identity, the logistics position, the older and unremarkable face he'd worn for 2 months, remained, as far as he could determine, entirely unconnected to the basement killings in any official file. But an unremarkable face bought only so much time against a determined investigation, and Muzan had survived a millennium precisely by never mistaking a temporary advantage for a permanent one. He considered, seated in his apartment with the same patient deliberation he applied to every decision, 3 paths forward. He could vanish entirely, abandon the logistics identity, construct an entirely new face and history, retreat to the deepest obscurity this world offered, and begin the slow work of learning its shape from an even greater distance. It was the safest option, and the one that offended him most. He had not crossed into an unfamiliar world to spend it cowering from a bureaucracy's paperwork. He could eliminate the threat directly, locate this Eraserhead, this Detective Tsukauchi, whoever else had been assigned to the case, and remove them before their investigation matured into something dangerous. It was tempting in its simplicity, and he dismissed it within the same breath he considered it. A hero's death, this early, with no clear pattern established yet to obscure the motive, would not quiet this world's authorities. It would galvanize them, turn a quiet bureaucratic review into the kind of public, resourced manhunt he'd spent 2 months carefully avoiding provoking. Or he could do what he had, in truth, already begun deciding weeks before the review opened. Back in that unhurried moment watching Eraserhead subdue a rock-skinned villain in the street, demonstrate himself, deliberately, on his own terms, to an audience he selected, rather than one that found him by accident. He thought again of Chisaki, cold, methodical, patient in his own considerable way, sitting atop an organization with genuine resources and an established practice of operating beneath the Commission's notice. An organization that had already, through its clumsy initial approach, signaled interest in acquiring exactly the kind of power Muzan represented. Chisaki wanted to understand him. Wanted, Muzan suspected with the particular clarity of a creature who had spent 1,000 years reading the ambitions of men who thought themselves clever, to eventually attempt exactly what his organization's reputation suggested: extraction, replication, the reduction of Muzan's nature into something that could be bottled, distributed, controlled. That ambition amused him. It also, Muzan decided, presented an opportunity worth exploring, not because he had any intention of allowing himself to be understood in the way Chisaki hoped, but because an alliance of convenience with an organization already operating outside the Commission's reach offered considerably more cover than continuing to navigate this world entirely alone. He would not trust Chisaki. He trusted no one. Trust was, in his considered opinion, simply a delay mechanism for betrayal, and he had learned that lesson from both sides of the equation, across a very long life. But an organization willing to shelter an unclassifiable anomaly in exchange for what it believed might eventually be extractable knowledge was a tool worth picking up, provided he never once forgot which of them was actually using the other. He returned to the false clinic 3 nights later, unannounced, walking through the front of the shuttered building with the same unhurried calm he'd shown at their first meeting, and found Rappa on watch in the entry corridor, who very nearly threw the first punch out of pure startled reflex, before recognizing the face beneath a slightly different arrangement of features. "Boss is gonna want to know how you keep getting in here," Rappa said, more curious than alarmed, lowering his fists with visible effort. "Tell him I've reconsidered his interest in understanding what I am," Muzan said, "and that I've decided there may be some mutual benefit in continuing the conversation, on terms I intend to set." Chisaki received him in the same immaculate office, the same folded gloved hands, the same unreadable eyes above the surgical mask, though something in his posture this time carried a fraction more attention. The particular focus of a man who'd spent 2 months turning over an unsolved problem and had just been handed an unexpected new variable. "I didn't expect you to return," Chisaki said. "I'd begun to assume you'd concluded I wasn't worth the trouble." "You're not, in the sense you're hoping for," Muzan said, settling into the offered chair with the same precise economy of motion he brought to everything. "I have no intention of allowing you or anyone else to take apart what I am and reconstruct it for your own purposes. That ambition, if you continue to pursue it, will end considerably worse for you than it will for me. Then why come back at all? Because your organization has spent 15 years learning to operate beneath a commission that has, as of 9 days ago, opened a formal review into 3 deaths I'm responsible for." Muzan watched the flicker of genuine surprise cross what little of Chisaki's expression showed above the mask, and continued, unhurried. "I find myself, for the first time since arriving in this world, in need of a degree of cover I cannot manufacture entirely on my own. You have resources, infrastructure, an established practice of existing where the Commission chooses not to look. I am prepared to make that arrangement worth your while, provided you understand from the outset precisely what you will and will not be permitted to learn." Chisaki was quiet for a long moment, weighing the offer with the same careful calculation Muzan had expected, the same instinct that had built an entire criminal empire on knowing exactly how much to take and exactly when not to overreach. "What would you offer, precisely, in exchange for that cover?" "Information," Muzan said. "I've spent 2 months learning the shape of your commission, your heroes, your rival faction across the city. I know things about how this world's authorities classify and hunt anomalies that your organization, for all its resources, has never had reason to learn firsthand, because your organization has never once produced anything they couldn't eventually classify. A faint, cold note entered his voice. The closest he came to something like amusement. I have. That knowledge is worth considerably more to a man in your position than whatever you imagine you might extract from taking me apart. Chisaki considered this for a long moment, and Muzan watched him do it. Watched the calculation play out behind those sharp, unreadable eyes, ambition weighing itself against caution, curiosity against the plain, unmissable fact that the creature across the desk had made clear, without raising his voice once, that any attempt at extraction would end badly for the man attempting it. Provisional cooperation, Chisaki said finally. You provide what you know about Commission investigative patterns. In exchange, my organization extends you the same operational cover we extend our own people. False identities, safe locations, advance warning if my sources indicate Commission attention is closing in. A pause, deliberate, weighted. But understand this in return. I do not extend that cover indefinitely, and I do not extend it for free. The day I decide the arrangement no longer benefits me, or the day I find a way to learn what you are without your cooperation, this conversation is over. Naturally, Muzan said, rising from the chair with the same unhurried finality he'd shown at their first meeting, entirely untroubled by the implicit threat, because he had already decided, in the quiet calculating corner of his mind, that had outlived 1,000 years of men who imagined they held the upper hand, precisely how long he intended to allow this arrangement to serve his purposes before discarding it entirely. It was not an alliance. Muzan did not believe in alliances, not truly, not after 1,000 years of watching every bond he'd ever permitted himself curdle eventually into either betrayal or inconvenience. It was, he reflected, walking back through the false clinic's cold corridors toward the surface, simply a more efficient shape for the same patient hunt he'd always conducted, using this world's own fractured, ambitious, self-interested factions as cover, while he learned, at his own unhurried pace, exactly which of them deserved to understand, eventually, precisely what kind of thing had entered their world. Behind him, in the immaculate office, Kai Chisaki sat very still for a long while after the door closed, turning the arrangement over with the same meticulous attention he gave everything, already beginning, because ambition, in a man like Chisaki, never truly rested, to calculate exactly how he might eventually turn provisional cooperation into something considerably more permanent. The arrangement, in its first month, functioned better than either party fully admitted to expecting. Muzan provided, in careful increments designed to demonstrate value without ever revealing more than necessary, a working picture of how the Hero Public Safety Commission's classification hearings unfolded, the evidentiary thresholds required to escalate a case to special case designation, the internal politics that slowed or accelerated a review depending on which liaison officer held it, the specific investigative patterns Eraserhead's field office favored when working an unknown. Chisaki, in turn, extended exactly what he'd promised, a rotation of false identities maintained through the Shie Hasakai's existing document forgers, safe locations scattered across 3 districts, and, more valuable than either, though Muzan suspected Chisaki hadn't fully registered the cost of offering it, early warning drawn from a commission informant on the organization's payroll, a mid-level administrator who fed Chisaki's people advance notice whenever a case file touched anything connected to the Yakuza's known operations. It was, Muzan reflected during the quieter stretches of that first month, a genuinely useful education in how power actually organized itself in this world, not through the clean public hierarchy of licensed heroes and ranked agencies that the Commission presented to its citizens, but through this messier, more honest substrate underneath. Informants and forged papers, favors extended and favors called in, an entire second economy of leverage running parallel to the official one, and considerably more revealing of how the world truly worked. He used the month well. He confirmed, through careful and deliberately unhurried observation, the actual limits of the Commission's investigative reach. How far Aizawa's team had gotten in the throat-wound case. Not far. The 40% match reports remained the best lead they had, and Muzan noted with private satisfaction that his own careful anonymity across two different identities had left the investigation with almost nothing concrete to build from. He learned, through Chisaki's informant network, the rough shape of the League of Villains' current operations, Shigaraki's restless, escalating ambitions, a warp Quirk lieutenant who handled logistics with an almost courtly formality, an organization still finding its footing, but clearly building toward something larger than street-level chaos. And he learned, with the particular attention he reserved for genuine threats rather than mere curiosities, about a figure the underworld spoke of only in careful, lowered tones, a man called All for One, whose reputation suggested a power considerably more dangerous than anything else this world had yet shown him, a Quirk, according to every fragment Muzan could piece together, capable of stealing another person's ability outright and wielding it as his own. That detail, more than any other he'd gathered in his 2.5 months in this world, earned genuine consideration. He turned it over during the long, quiet hours of his current identity's evening routine. A modest apartment 3 districts from the logistics firm, curtains drawn, the particular stillness he permitted himself only when no one watched. A power that stole other powers. He had, across 1,000 years, encountered exactly one threat that operated on a similar principle. The Demon Slayer Corps' own understanding that his blood, properly refined and administered, could theoretically be replicated, or countered by someone willing to study it closely enough. He had spent centuries ensuring no one ever got close enough to attempt it. If this all-for-one's ability functioned the way rumor suggested, a direct theft or transfer of another's power, rather than the crude external tools Chisaki's organization employed, then Muzan's own nature might, in theory, present an entirely different category of problem for such a man to solve. His power had never originated from anything resembling a quirk. It came from demon blood, forcibly integrated into a body already dying, refined across 1,000 years of consumption into something that operated on principles this world's biology had never once produced. Whether a quirk-stealing ability could take hold of something that wasn't, in any meaningful sense, a quirk at all remained an open question, and Muzan had survived as long as he had, by never assuming an open question resolved in his favor without testing it himself, carefully, and never at a moment of his opponent's choosing. He filed the concern away with the same patient thoroughness he applied to everything, and made a private, unhurried decision. All for One was a threat to be understood from a considerable distance, for as long as that distance remained available to him. Whatever eventual confrontation this world's fractured power structures were building toward, and Muzan had lived long enough to recognize the shape of an inevitable confrontation gathering itself in the space between an ambitious young villain leader and the Commission's growing unease. He intended to enter it, if he entered it at all, on his own terms, at a time of his own choosing, having already confirmed exactly what such a man could and could not do to him. The unraveling of the arrangement's usefulness began, as these things often did, with Chisaki's ambition finally outgrowing his patience. It was 6 weeks into their provisional cooperation, in a private meeting called at Chisaki's request rather than Muzan's, that the first real friction surfaced. Chisaki received him in the same immaculate office, though something in his posture that evening carried a different quality than their previous meetings, a barely restrained eagerness that Muzan recognized immediately as dangerous. the particular energy of a man who believed he'd found an angle his caution had previously denied him. "I have a proposal," Chisaki said, without his usual preamble. "Not extraction. I understand your position on that remains absolute, and I've come to respect the wisdom of not testing it directly." A pause. Calculated. The kind of pause a man used when building towards something he expected resistance to. "But there is a woman, a young girl in truth, though her biology has already proven more capable than any adult donor I've encountered, whose quirk allows the transfer of abilities between subjects, under the right conditions, with the right preparation. I have spent years cultivating her development for exactly this purpose. If your nature could be observed, even partially, through a controlled transfer rather than direct extraction." "No," Muzan said, before Chisaki finished the sentence, the single word carrying a flat, absolute finality that emptied the room of whatever eagerness Chisaki had walked in with. "You haven't heard the full proposal." "I don't need to." Muzan's eyes, in the low office light, took on the particular molten quality they assumed when his patience narrowed toward its actual limit, a limit considerably shorter than Chisaki, in his ambition, had apparently allowed himself to believe. "You are proposing to test, on a living subject, whether my nature can be captured, transferred, or replicated by any mechanism this world possesses. I told you, the night I returned to this office, precisely what would happen to a man who pursued that ambition, regardless of how carefully he dressed it in a proposal. I do not repeat myself as a courtesy, Chisaki. I repeat myself as a final warning." Something in the stillness that followed, the particular quality of a room in which a predator considerably older and more dangerous than anyone present had just, without raising his voice, made the actual stakes of the conversation unmistakable, seemed finally to register with Chisaki in a way 2.5 months of careful, controlled interactions hadn't fully accomplished. Chisaki understood in that moment with sudden and genuine clarity, not negotiating with an unusually gifted villain who happened to operate outside standard classification. He was negotiating with something that had, on some fundamental level, never actually needed his cooperation at all, had extended it, permitted it, precisely because the arrangement served a purpose that had now, apparently, reached the edge of its usefulness. "Understood," Chisaki said, and meant it, in the particular careful way of a man recalibrating an entire strategy in real time. "I withdraw the proposal." "Good," Muzan said, rising from his chair with the same unhurried finality that had ended every previous meeting between them. "I'd advise you not to raise a similar one again. The cover your organization provides has been useful, Chisaki. It has not been irreplaceable, and I would remind you that the reverse of our arrangement is equally true. I know a great deal now about how your operation functions, how it hides, and how the Commission's own investigative patterns might be steered, with sufficient patience, toward exactly the kind of scrutiny an organization like yours can least afford. It wasn't a threat delivered with heat. It never was. With Muzan. That was, Chisaki reflected long after the meeting ended, and he sat alone in his immaculate office, turning the exchange over with mounting unease, precisely what made it so much more effective than heat would have been. A threat delivered in anger could be weathered, worked around, eventually forgiven in the transactional way villains forgave each other threats made in the middle of genuine conflict. A threat delivered with the same flat, unhurried calm a man might use to discuss the weather, suggested something Chisaki, for all his intelligence, found himself entirely unequipped to counter. That the creature across the desk had already, calmly and without malice, calculated exactly how the relationship would end, if pushed past its usefulness, and had simply chosen, for now, not to end it. Muzan left the false clinic that night with a clarity he hadn't fully possessed before the meeting. The arrangement with Chisaki's organization, however useful it had proven, carried a shelf life he could now measure with some precision. Ambition, like Chisaki's, did not simply retreat from a closed door. It waited, recalibrated, and eventually found a different door to try. He would continue drawing on the cover for as long as it remained genuinely useful. A matter of weeks, he suspected, rather than months. But the encounter had sharpened something in him that had been gathering shape since his very first night in this world, watching Eraserhead switch off a villain's ability with nothing more than a sustained look. He had spent nearly 3 months now learning this world from its edges, its underworld, its bureaucracy, its fractured criminal factions. Patient, careful, unhurried, exactly as he'd have approached any new territory in his previous life. But patience, he reminded himself again, walking through Yokohama's cooling autumn streets, in a face none of the city's cameras had yet learned to flag, had never been an end unto itself. He had learned enough, now, of this world's shape to understand roughly where its true centers of power sat. The commission above, the licensed heroes beneath it, the villains and yakuza operating in the spaces between, and somewhere at the furthest edge of what he'd confirmed, a man called All for One, whose power might, alone among everything he'd encountered here, represent a genuine unknown. The next demonstration, when it came, would not be another quiet basement killing that a bureaucracy took 9 weeks to properly notice. It would be deliberate, chosen, witnessed by precisely the audience he selected, delivering precisely the message he intended, at precisely the moment of his own choosing. He simply needed, first, to decide exactly what that message should be, and to whom, among this world's heroes, villains, and quietly ambitious yakuza bosses, it would prove most useful to deliver it. The decision, when Muzan finally settled on it, came not from impulse but from the same patient arithmetic that had governed every choice he'd made since falling through that basement rift. He had spent 3 months as a rumor, a set of unexplained bodies, a shape half glimpsed by an underworld too frightened to speak clearly about what it had seen. Rumors left uncorrected eventually took on a life of their own, and Muzan had learned, across 1,000 years, that an uncontrolled rumor was considerably more dangerous than a controlled demonstration. He chose his audience with care, not the commission directly, too soon, too formal, too likely to trigger the kind of coordinated, resourced response he still lacked sufficient information to counter with confidence. Not the League of Villains. Shigaraki's organization remained, by every account Muzan had gathered, more interested in destruction for its own sake than in the kind of careful, transactional respect Muzan required from anyone he permitted close enough to matter. He chose, instead, a target that would accomplish 3 things simultaneously: demonstrate his capability beyond any bureaucratic doubt, sever his increasingly costly dependence on Chisaki's organization, and do both in a manner precise enough that no innocent bystander's death would muddy the message into something the commission could dismiss as random villainy. He chose the informant, the mid-level commission administrator who had, for 2.5 months, fed Chisaki's organization advance warning of investigative movements. A man named Ikuta, whom Muzan had never met directly, but had learned everything necessary about through Chisaki's own careless conversations. A man who sold his government's secrets for money and would, inevitably, sell whatever he'd learned about Muzan's existence for the same price the moment the arrangement stopped benefiting him. Removing him solved a liability. It also, if handled correctly, delivered a message directly into the heart of the commission's own building, not through a leak, not through rumor, but through evidence too precise to have arrived any other way. He moved on a Thursday evening, in the unremarkable face of a delivery courier, into a residential building in a quiet administrative district where Ikuta lived alone in a modest apartment, paid for with money he shouldn't have had. Muzan did not rush. He never rushed. He simply arrived, at the appointed hour, and by the time he left 40 minutes later, he had learned everything Ikuta knew about the Commission's internal classification protocols, everything Ikuta had reported to Chisaki's people over the preceding months, and had left behind, on the apartment's kitchen table, something he had never once left at a previous scene, a message. Not written. Muzan had no interest in the theatrical flourish of a note, the kind of villain's calling card this world's more attention-seeking criminals apparently favored. He left, instead, Ikuta's commission identification badge, placed with deliberate precision atop a folder of documents detailing the informant's illegal dealings with a known Yakuza organization, evidence Muzan had gathered over months of patient listening, assembled now into a package too damning for the Commission to ignore, and too specific to have originated from any source, other than someone with genuine access to both the Commission's internal workings and the Shie Hasaikai's operations. It was, Muzan understood with a certain cold satisfaction, an elegant solution to several problems at once. The Commission would find corruption at its own heart, forcing an internal reckoning that would consume investigative resources for weeks. Chisaki's organization would lose its inside source and understand, without needing to be told directly, that Muzan's patience with the arrangement had formally ended. And somewhere in the resulting chaos, buried in a case file that would take considerable time to properly untangle, the Commission would find a body with no Quirk signature, and finally understand that whatever had killed 3 men in a basement 3 months ago had not, in fact, gone quiet. The discovery, the following morning, did not go to Aizawa's desk. It went first to the Commission's Internal Affairs Division, which spent 4 days working through the corruption angle before anyone thought to cross-reference the death itself against the ongoing unregistered anomaly case, a delay that would later become, in the Commission's own internal review, a case study in exactly the kind of departmental silo failure that let genuine threats slip through bureaucratic cracks. It was Naomasa Tsukauchi, following up on the original throat-wound case out of the same stubborn thoroughness that had kept it open past standard closure, who made the connection first. He'd requested a standing flag on any death in the greater metro area matching the original case's forensic profile. No blood at the scene, closing puncture wounds, no confirmed Quirk signature, and the flag caught Ikuta's death on the 5th day, well after Internal Affairs had already begun quietly congratulating itself on uncovering a corruption ring. Tsukauchi read the combined file in his cramped precinct office with a growing, uneasy stillness. 3 deaths in a basement 3 months ago. Now a 4th, delivered with a precision that suggested deliberate intent rather than the opportunistic violence of the earlier killings, and delivered, more troublingly, directly into the Commission's own internal corruption investigation, as though whoever was responsible had wanted the 2 cases to collide. He brought the file to Aizawa personally that same afternoon. "It's not just repeating," Tsukauchi said, laying the combined documentation across Aizawa's desk. "It's evolving. The first 3 killings look almost accidental, like whoever did it was caught off guard and reacted. This one's staged, deliberate. Whoever's responsible wanted us to find the corruption angle specifically, which means they either know exactly how our internal investigations work, or someone's been feeding them information about how we work." Aizawa studied the photographs with the same flat, focused attention he'd brought to the original case 3 months earlier, though something in his posture now carried a harder edge, the particular tightness of a hero who understood, reading between the careful lines of a case file, that he was no longer looking at an isolated incident, but at the opening moves of something considerably larger. 4 deaths, no Quirk signature on any of them, and now evidence this person has access to information about Commission internal operations that shouldn't exist outside the building. He set the file down. "I want a full liaison escalation, not another routine review. I want this flagged as an active, unresolved threat with unknown capability, and I want it in front of the Commission's Threat Assessment Board by end of week." "That's going to draw attention," Tsukauchi said, not disagreeing, simply stating the practical consequence. Threat Assessment Board involvement means this stops being a quiet investigation. Other agencies are going to want in. Possibly UA, if the board decides the pattern warrants training-level awareness. "Good," Aizawa said, with the particular grim flatness of a man who'd learned, across a long career, that some threats got more dangerous the longer they stayed quiet. "Whatever this is, it stopped being subtle enough to handle small. I'd rather have more eyes on it now than explain to a threat assessment board in 6 months why we sat on 4 unexplained deaths and a corruption case that might be connected." The Threat Assessment Board convened 5 days later, in a commission conference room 3 floors below the public-facing offices most citizens associated with hero licensing and agency oversight. Aizawa presented the case with his usual economy, laying out the 4 deaths, the forensic anomalies, the apparent connection to Ikuta's corruption, and by extension, to whatever organization had been paying Ikuta for commission information. The board, 5 senior officials with authority spanning investigative resource allocation, agency coordination, and, in the case of its most senior member, direct oversight of special case escalations, listened with the particular weighted attention such rooms reserved for genuinely unresolved threats. "You're describing an ability with no Quirk signature at all," said the board's chair, a stern woman named Reiko Utsushimi, whose career had been built on exactly the kind of careful institutional caution the situation now demanded. Not unregistered, not disguised, genuinely absent from every detection method we have. "That's," she paused, choosing her words with evident care. "That's not something we've encountered before, not at this level of confirmed lethality. There are precedent cases of extremely subtle quirks evading detection thresholds," offered another board member, a data analysis specialist named Godai, though his tone carried more hope than conviction. "Emitter types with minimal energy output, certain mutation types with biological signatures close enough to baseline human that our scanners register false negatives. 4 for 4 negative isn't a false negative pattern," Aizawa cut in. "That's a consistent absence. I've read every precedent case in the file, and none of them show this kind of total signature failure across multiple separate incidents. Whatever's doing this isn't dodging our detection. It's genuinely not registering as a quirk in the first place." The room went quiet at that, the particular quiet of professionals confronting an idea their entire training had not prepared them to easily accommodate. "If that's accurate," Utsushimi said slowly, "then we're not looking at an unregistered ability. We're looking at something operating entirely outside the framework our containment and classification systems were built around." She looked around the table, gauging the weight of what she was about to authorize. "I'm elevating this to special case designation, effective immediately, full investigative authority, cross-agency coordination, and," a pause, the decision costing her something visible, even in her carefully controlled expression, "I want UA's staff briefed. Not the students, not yet. But if we're dealing with something our standard containment tools genuinely cannot touch, I want the people training the next generation of heroes aware that such a thing might exist, before it becomes their problem to solve without warning." Aizawa nodded, already turning over in his mind the considerable list of consequences that decision would set in motion. Resources reallocated, other agencies pulled into a case that had, until 5 days ago, belonged quietly to his office alone, and somewhere out there, still unnamed and unlocated, a threat that had just, without knowing it, forced open the door to precisely the kind of attention it had spent 3 careful months avoiding. Muzan learned of the special case escalation 9 days later, through a considerably degraded version of his previous information network, Chisaki's organization, still reeling from the loss of its commission informant and the unmistakable message Muzan had delivered alongside it, proved far less forthcoming than it had been during the height of their arrangement. He gathered what he could through more painstaking means, careful listening in the logistics firm's break room, where couriers now spoke, with genuine unease, of a commission-wide alert circulating through hero agencies about an unclassifiable threat. A fragment of overheard conversation between two junior heroes at a delivery drop, mentioning UA staff briefings and a name, Eraserhead, attached to the case with unusual prominence. He absorbed the news with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, though the private, calculating part of his mind registered, with something almost like satisfaction, that the message he'd chosen to deliver through Ikuta's death had accomplished precisely what he'd intended. He was no longer a rumor. He was, as of 9 days ago, an officially designated threat, discussed in rooms with genuine authority, attached now, however distantly, to the name of a hero he'd personally observed switch off another man's power, with nothing more than a look. It was, Muzan reflected, watching the city's evening lights flicker on from the window of his current apartment, precisely the beginning he had chosen. Not an accident discovered by a bureaucracy too slow to notice him. A deliberate first note, struck at a moment and in a manner entirely of his own choosing, that had now set in motion the very attention he'd spent 3 patient months preparing to survive. The hunted phase of this world's response to him, he understood with total clarity, had only just begun. He found himself, turning the thought over with the particular cold anticipation he reserved for genuinely worthy opponents, not the least bit troubled by that fact. UA's staff briefing convened on a gray Wednesday afternoon in a conference room typically reserved for faculty disciplinary matters, chosen for its privacy rather than its comfort. Principal Nezu sat at the head of the table, small paws folded atop a single sheet of notes, his usual bright, analytical demeanor, tempered by the particular gravity of a briefing he'd requested be kept strictly among senior staff. Aizawa presented the case a second time, more thoroughly than he had to the Threat Assessment Board, laying out 4 deaths, the forensic anomalies, the total absence of Quirk signature across every incident, and the deliberate, almost surgical precision of the most recent killing. No signature at all, President Mike repeated, arms crossed, his usual booming energy dampened to something more careful. Not weak, not disguised, nothing. Correct, Aizawa said, which means every containment protocol built around Quirk suppression may be functionally useless against it. Cuffs, trigger counter drugs, even my own erasure. I have no confirmed data either way, but if this thing's ability doesn't originate from a Quirk factor at all, there's a real possibility it doesn't respond to erasure the way a standard ability would. Midnight, seated near the window with her arms folded, frowned at that. You're describing something that might be functionally unstoppable by every tool we've built our entire containment doctrine around. I'm describing something we don't yet understand well enough to say for certain, Aizawa corrected, though the distinction offered little comfort in the room's tightening silence. Which is worse, honestly. An unstoppable known quantity you plan around. This, we can't plan around yet, because we don't know what it actually is. Nezu tapped one small claw against the table, thoughtful. The pattern is instructive, even absent a mechanism. 3 killings in apparent reaction to an ambush. A creature caught off guard, responding with lethal but not excessive force. Then silence, for nearly 3 months. Then a single, extremely deliberate killing, staged to deliver information directly into our own internal corruption investigation. He looked around the table, bright eyes moving from face to face. This is not a creature acting on instinct or bloodlust. This is a mind, patient, observant, capable of gathering intelligence on our own internal systems sophisticated enough to weaponize a corruption case as a message. I would suggest, gentlemen and ladies, that we are dealing with something considerably more dangerous than an unclassifiable killer. We are dealing with an unclassifiable killer who is also, by every available indication, smarter than most of the villains we've previously prepared our students to face. The room absorbed that assessment in the particular heavy quiet of professionals who had just had their working assumptions meaningfully revised. "What do we tell the students?" Midnight asked. "Nothing, for now," Nezu said. "Not until we have more than a threat profile and a body count. A vague warning about an unnamed, unstoppable killer serves no pedagogical purpose and considerable potential for panic. But I want every staff member in this room maintaining heightened situational awareness during patrol rotations and field placements, and I want Detective Tsukauchi's office to have a direct line to this school the moment anything resembling a confirmed sighting emerges." His pause unfolded, a small, deliberate gesture of closing the matter for now, though nothing in his tone suggested he considered it closed in any meaningful sense. "In the meantime, I would very much like to know more about the informant, Ikuta. If this creature had genuine working knowledge of our internal corruption investigation processes, that knowledge came from somewhere specific. I want that thread pulled as far as it goes." The thread led, over the following 2 weeks, exactly where Muzan had expected it eventually would, though he had not anticipated it arriving quite so quickly. Back to the Shie Hasaikai. Tsukauchi's team, working in tandem with a small commission task force now assigned full-time to the special case, traced the corruption evidence Muzan had left behind, through Ikuta's financial records, to a pattern of payments originating from shell accounts the Commission's Financial Crimes Division had, in fact, already flagged 18 months prior as possibly connected to Yakuza laundering operations, a case that had gone quiet for lack of resources before this new investigation gave it sudden, urgent priority. It was not, Tsukauchi understood immediately upon seeing the connection, definitive proof that the Shie Hasaikai itself had any relationship with the unclassifiable killer. It was, however, exactly the kind of thread a competent investigator pulled regardless. And by the 3rd week following the Threat Assessment Board's special case designation, a joint task force drawing personnel from 3 different agencies had begun quietly building a case file on Kai Chisaki's organization that went considerably deeper than anything the Commission had previously assembled. Muzan learned of this development through his own increasingly strained channels, and understood, with the particular cold clarity that had kept him alive across 1,000 years of similar close calls, that his message to the Commission had accomplished its purpose rather too well. He had intended to sever his dependence on Chisaki's organization and announce his own capability in a single deliberate stroke. He had not fully accounted for the possibility that doing so would draw renewed, intensified scrutiny onto Chisaki's operation as a direct consequence. Scrutiny that, if it succeeded in exposing the Shie Hasaikai's activities, might eventually surface details about their brief, uneasy cooperation that Muzan would have preferred remained buried entirely. It was, he acknowledged to himself with the particular discipline of a mind that had survived a millennium by never once refusing to examine its own miscalculations, an imperfect outcome, not a failure. The message had reached its intended audience, and his standing as a confirmed, named threat within the Commission's highest investigative tier represented genuine progress toward the eventual reckoning he understood was coming, regardless of how carefully he navigated the interim. But imperfect nonetheless, and worth correcting before the correction became considerably more difficult to make. He did not warn Chisaki. Warning him would have required re-establishing exactly the kind of direct contact Muzan had spent the preceding weeks deliberately avoiding, now that the arrangement's usefulness had ended, and its risks had begun actively compounding. He simply noted the development, filed it alongside his broader understanding of this world's investigative machinery, and turned his attention instead to the question that had occupied him with growing urgency since the special case designation first reached him. How, precisely, He intended to meet the escalating attention now converging on him, and on what terms. Chisaki learned of the Joint Task Force's renewed interest in his organization through his own network. 3 days after Tsukauchi's team formally opened the expanded investigation, considerably faster than the Commission's operational security would have preferred, though not fast enough. Chisaki understood with mounting fury to have prevented the scrutiny from beginning in the first place. He summoned Rappa and Tengai to his office that same evening, his usual clinical calm fractured by something closer to genuine anger than either enforcer had previously witnessed from their meticulous, controlled boss. He did this deliberately, Chisaki said, pacing behind his desk with uncharacteristic restlessness, his gloved hands flexing at his sides. Killed our informant. Left evidence connecting the corruption directly back to accounts we've spent years insulating from exactly this kind of scrutiny. He knew precisely what that would trigger, and he did it anyway, because severing ties with us mattered more to him than the damage it would do on his way out the door. So we go after him, Rappa said, cracking his knuckles with the particular eagerness that had, on more than one occasion, gotten him into fights considerably above his ability to win. Teach him cooperation's a two-way street. We tried that once already, Tengai said, arms crossed, voice flat with the memory of standing in that first meeting and watching their boss's confident interrogation dissolve into something closer to negotiation than either enforcer had expected. Didn't go especially well. Chisaki stopped pacing, standing very still for a long moment, working through the calculation with the same methodical precision he brought to every decision, ambition and caution weighing against each other in a balance that had, for 2.5 months, consistently tipped toward caution, where the man in white was concerned. Not directly, he said finally. Not yet, but I want him found, and I want a comprehensive profile built. Every identity he's used, every location he's occupied, every person he's had contact with since he first appeared. If this investigation continues tightening around my organization, I intend to have leverage of my own available before it reaches a point where I have none. He resumed his slow pace, thinking aloud now in the particular way he did when a plan was still assembling itself. He believes himself untouchable, because our tools have failed against him so far. That belief is not the same as truth. Every creature has a mechanism, even one this world has never catalogued. I intend to find his, before the Commission's own investigation forces my hand into a confrontation I haven't prepared for. It was, Chisaki reflected, watching Rappa and Tengai depart to begin the search, a considerably more dangerous ambition than the extraction proposal Muzan had already refused once, in terms unmistakably final. But Chisaki had built an empire on refusing to accept cannot as a permanent condition, and 3 months of frustrated curiosity had, if anything, only sharpened that refusal into something closer to obsession. The Commission's investigation and Chisaki's parallel search both, in their own ways, converged on the same fundamental obstacle over the following month. Muzan Kibutsuji left almost nothing behind for either of them to find. He abandoned the logistics identity within a week of learning about the renewed scrutiny on Chisaki's organization, dissolving it with the same unhurried thoroughness he'd once applied to erasing every trace of a hunted life in his previous world. Resignation letters, quiet departures, the careful unwinding of an identity's every documented thread, until nothing remained that a determined investigator could follow forward. He constructed a new face, a new name, a new modest position, this time deliberately chosen in a district considerably further from both the Commission's most active investigative resources and the Shie Hasaikai's usual territory, a small coastal city, 3 hours south of Yokohama by train, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of place a predator willing to wait could disappear into for months without drawing notice. He did not, however, retreat entirely into passive hiding, because passivity, he had come to understand across 3.5 months in this world, carried its own considerable cost. A hunted creature that vanished entirely, eventually became, in the minds of its hunters, either dead or gone, and either conclusion, left uncorrected for too long, risked the Commission's special case designation, quietly losing priority and resources, exactly the kind of institutional attrition that might, in time, allow him to be forgotten, rather than confronted. Muzan had no interest in being forgotten. He had crossed into this world to understand it, to test it, and eventually, though he had not yet fully admitted this ambition even to the private, unhurried corner of his mind where he examined his own intentions most honestly, to determine whether it, like every world before it, might eventually be made to answer to him. He began, in his new coastal obscurity, a different kind of preparation, not information gathering, which he judged largely complete for the phase of understanding he currently required, but genuine testing. He sought out, over the following weeks, increasingly dangerous specimens of this world's abnormal biology. Not heroes, not yet, but the kind of high-tier villains and rogue quirk users who operated at the edges of organized crime, testing his own capabilities against theirs, with the same careful, incremental discipline he'd once applied to confirming exactly which techniques a given Hashira's breathing style could and couldn't counter. He learned, across a dozen such encounters conducted in the same quiet, methodical manner, several things of genuine value: that his regeneration, transplanted whole from his previous existence, functioned in this world exactly as it always had. Wounds that would have ended an ordinary combatant, closing within seconds. Entire limbs restored from injuries that left his opponents, in their final confused moments, uncertain whether they'd actually landed the blow they were certain they had. That his own biological weaponry, the whip-like extensions he could draw from his own body, reshaped and redirected with lethal precision, cut through this world's quirk-enhanced physiology with the same efficiency it had once cut through demon and human alike, unimpeded by any defensive ability he tested it against. That his hypnotic influence, subtle and near undetectable, worked as effectively on minds shaped by this world's culture as it ever had on his own, a discovery that troubled him rather less than it perhaps should have, given how casually he began, in these quiet testing encounters, to employ it. And he confirmed, with the particular cold satisfaction of a hypothesis proven correct, that nothing in this world's arsenal of quirk-countering tools, not the suppressant compounds a rogue chemist attempted against him, not the containment field a desperate support item smuggler deployed in a final act of self-preservation, registered against him in any capacity at all. He was not resisting these tools. He was, in the truest sense, simply not the kind of thing they were built to touch. By the close of that month, alone in his coastal apartment with the accumulated confirmation of a dozen careful tests behind him, Muzan Kibutsuji allowed himself a private, unhurried conclusion he had been circling since his very first night in this world, watching Eraserhead extinguish a stranger's power, with nothing more than a look. This world, for all its unfamiliar architecture of licensed heroism and catalogued ability, did not yet possess a single tool capable of genuinely threatening him. It was, he understood with the particular clarity of a creature who had spent 1,000 years fearing exactly two things: sunlight and Nichirin steel, both entirely, categorically absent from this world's arsenal, the closest he had come, in all his long, unnatural existence, to something resembling true safety. He did not yet know about One for All. He did not yet know about All for One's actual capabilities, tested rather than rumored. He did not yet know what a cornered commission, given enough time and enough resources, might eventually assemble in genuine desperation. But for the first time since falling through that basement rift, Muzan Kibutsuji permitted himself to consider, with the particular slow-dawning satisfaction of an apex predator recognizing ideal terrain, that this new world might not merely be survivable. It might, in time, be his. The coastal city offered Muzan 4 months of genuine quiet, the longest uninterrupted stretch of true anonymity he'd experienced since falling through that basement rift, and he used it with the same patient discipline that had governed every prior phase of his time in this world. He did not test himself further against increasingly dangerous specimens. He had gathered, by his own estimation, sufficient confirmation of his own capabilities relative to this world's tools. Instead, he turned his attention outward, resuming the careful information gathering that had served him so well before Chisaki's ambition and the Commission's escalating scrutiny had forced him into deeper hiding. He learned, through patient cultivation of a new set of low-level contacts in his adopted coastal city, that the joint task force investigating the Shie Hasaikai had, after months of pressure, largely stalled. Chisaki's organization proving considerably more disciplined about covering its tracks than Muzan had anticipated, and the Commission's resources, stretched thin across a special case designation that had produced no confirmed sighting in over 4 months, beginning the slow institutional drift toward reduced priority that Muzan had feared but not entirely expected to actually occur. He learned that the League of Villains had grown bolder in the intervening months, staging 2 incidents significant enough that even his coastal contacts had heard rumor of them: an attempted infiltration of some manner of hero training exercise, and a subsequent, more publicly visible clash that had, according to the fragmentary accounts reaching him, ended with the League's forces retreating rather than achieving whatever their objective had been. It was, Muzan reflected, absorbing these fragments with his usual unhurried patience, a useful confirmation of something he'd suspected since his earliest weeks in this world. Shigaraki's organization possessed ambition considerably in excess of its actual capability, at least for now. A useful data point, filed alongside everything else, though not yet one requiring any change to his own careful strategy. The quiet ended on a cold evening in early winter, in a manner Muzan had not fully anticipated despite 4 months of careful precaution, not through any failure of his own concealment, but through simple, unlucky coincidence. He had gone that evening to observe, from a careful, unremarkable distance, a hero patrol route through his coastal city's harbor district, part of his ongoing low-priority habit of maintaining current knowledge of local hero deployment patterns, regardless of how quiet his own circumstances had become. It was, in retrospect, an unnecessary risk taken out of habit rather than genuine need, and Muzan would spend a portion of the following weeks turning that realization over, with the particular cold self-honesty he reserved for his own miscalculations. The patrol belonged to a small local agency, 3 heroes on a routine harbor sweep, none of them names that had ever crossed Muzan's careful research, until one of them, a young hero still finishing her final year of provisional licensing through a regional training program, happened to glance down a narrow alley at precisely the moment Muzan crossed it in the unremarkable, older face he'd maintained for 4 months, and happened, through the particular ability her quirk granted her, a limited but genuine capacity to perceive residual energy signatures left behind by unusual biological processes, to register something about him that no standard quirk detection scan had ever managed to catch. "That's not right," she said, stopping mid-stride, staring at Muzan's retreating back with an expression that shifted, in the span of a few seconds, from confusion to genuine alarm. "Hey, wait, stop!" Muzan did not stop. He had learned, across 1,000 years, that a fleeing suspect drew exactly the kind of attention a cooperative one avoided, and in the calculating instant that followed her call, he weighed the value of continued anonymity against the cost of a confrontation he hadn't chosen the terms of, and concluded, with characteristic speed, that the anonymity was already compromised beyond recovery. He turned to face her instead, unhurried, his expression carrying nothing more alarming than mild, polite confusion. The face of an ordinary man startled by a hero's sudden shout. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "Your energy signature," she said, closing the distance with the particular reckless confidence of a young hero who hadn't yet learned, through hard experience, when caution mattered more than instinct. "It's wrong. It doesn't match anything human. What are you?" The two other heroes on her patrol, alerted by her raised voice, were already turning to look, closing the distance behind her, and Muzan understood, in the same calculating instant, that whatever happened in the next several seconds would determine considerably more than the fate of this single alley. He could vanish, reshape his face, lose himself in the harbor district's evening crowds before backup arrived, sacrifice this coastal identity as he'd sacrificed the logistics 1 month before. It remained, even now, his safest option. He could also, he understood with the particular cold clarity that had governed every major decision since his arrival, simply answer the question honestly, here, in a manner that finally, deliberately, ended the long patient phase of hiding he had maintained for 4.5 months, not through carelessness, but through genuine choice, because the moment had arrived, unplanned but not unwelcome, and Muzan Kibutsuji had never in 1,000 years been a creature who mistook an opportunity for a threat, merely because it arrived earlier than scheduled. "What I am," he said, his voice losing, in a single unhurried breath, every trace of the ordinary confusion he'd worn a moment before, "is considerably older than your training has prepared you to recognize." His face began, unhurried and without any visible strain, to shift, the ordinary features of his coastal identity dissolving, reshaping, resolving into the true face he had shown almost no one in this world, since Chisaki's office months before, pale and sharp and unmistakably wrong, in a way the young hero's specialized perception had already, correctly, flagged as impossible. She stumbled back, more from instinct than fear, already reaching for her quirk's more active application, calling something to her two colleagues that Muzan didn't bother parsing for detail, because the calculation that mattered had already resolved itself in his mind. 3 heroes, none of particular renown, none likely armed with the specific tools that might genuinely threaten him, encountering him now in a manner he hadn't fully chosen but was, on reflection, entirely willing to accept. "I'd advise your colleagues to keep their distance," Muzan said, and moved. What followed lasted, by the precise accounting later assembled from surveillance footage and eyewitness testimony, just under 90 seconds. The young hero who'd first spotted him, her name, the Commission's subsequent report would establish, was Sei Hirota, 22 years old, 11 months from completing her provisional license. Attempted, with the particular brave desperation of someone who understood she was badly outmatched but had no acceptable alternative to standing her ground, to bind him with a quirk that generated adhesive constructs from her palms. The constructs struck Muzan's advancing form and held, briefly, before the biological extensions he drew from his own body, thin, whip-like, and moving with a speed her eyes couldn't fully track, passed through both the construct and the arm that had generated it, with the same clean, unimpeded efficiency he'd confirmed a dozen times before, in careful private testing. She did not die. Muzan, in the calculating instant of the strike, chose the wound's placement with the same deliberate precision he'd shown in every prior encounter, disabling rather than lethal, because a heroic death this early, this publicly, would generate precisely the kind of galvanized institutional response he still preferred to delay rather than provoke. She fell, her arm ruined beyond any immediate use, screaming in a way that finally, fully alerted her two colleagues to the actual severity of what they'd stumbled into. The second hero, a broad-shouldered man whose quirk granted him considerable physical durability, closed the distance with genuine courage, absorbing a strike from Muzan's extensions that would have ended most opponents outright, and surviving it, badly wounded but alive, long enough to drag his fallen colleague back toward the harbor's main thoroughfare, while shouting for the third hero to call for backup rather than engage. The third hero did exactly that, and it was her call, relayed through her agency's emergency channel within seconds of the confrontation's start, that would, over the following hour, set in motion the first genuinely large-scale hero mobilization Muzan had yet provoked in this world. Muzan did not pursue them. He watched the two survivors retreat, the third hero's voice already carrying across the emergency channel with the particular controlled panic of someone reporting something her training had never once prepared her to describe accurately, and made, in the calm aftermath of the confrontation's brief violence, a final unhurried decision. He did not vanish. He remained, standing in the alley's cooling evening air, his true face fully visible now to whatever cameras the harbor district's surveillance network carried, and permitted himself, for the first time in nearly 5 months in this world, to simply be seen, not hunted down, not discovered through patient bureaucratic accident, but standing, deliberately, in full view of a world that had just, in the space of 90 seconds, learned considerably more about what it was actually dealing with than 4.5 months of careful investigation had previously managed to confirm. Let them come, he thought, with the particular cold, patient satisfaction of a creature who had spent 1,000 years being hunted and had decided, at last, in this new and unfamiliar world, that the hunt might finally run in the opposite direction. Let them see exactly what their careful classifications have failed, for 5 months, to properly name. I have learned this world's shape. I am no longer interested in learning it from its shadows. 20 minutes later, the first response team arrived. Not local agency heroes, but a rapid deployment unit dispatched under the special case designation standing protocol. 3 pro heroes of genuine regional renown, backed by a commissioned tactical team, equipped with every containment tool their 5 months of theoretical preparation had allowed them to assemble. Muzan watched them arrive with open, unhurried interest, and did not move from where he stood. The rising storm, 5 months in the making, had finally, unmistakably, broken. The rapid deployment unit arrived with the particular controlled precision of a team that had spent 5 months theorizing about exactly this moment, and had never once expected to actually face it on a random Tuesday evening in a coastal harbor district. Their commanding hero, a mid-40s man named Ryuko Tatsuma, whose quirk granted him the ability to generate and control localized water pressure with lethal force, and whose agency had been quietly designated, months earlier, as the Commission's primary response team should the special case anomaly ever surface, took one look at the scene before him and understood, with the particular cold clarity of a professional confronting a briefing document made suddenly, viscerally real, that nothing in his preparation had adequately conveyed what he was actually looking at. A man in white, standing motionless in the center of a harbor alley, his face unmistakably, impossibly wrong, not injured, not disguised, simply other, in a way that made Tatsuma's trained eye search reflexively for the visual tells of a quirk manifestation, and find none, only the flat, patient stillness of something that had clearly been waiting for exactly this arrival. Commissioned Tactical Unit, Tatsuma called, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who'd delivered similar warnings 100 times before, though none of those 100 times had prepared the particular unease now threading through it. You're ordered to stand down and submit to containment protocol. Cooperate, and this doesn't need to escalate. It will escalate regardless of my cooperation, Muzan said, his voice carrying across the alley, with the same unhurried calm he'd shown every prior encounter in this world. You've spent 5 months theorizing about what I am. I find myself curious what conclusions you've reached, and whether any of them will prove useful to you in the next several minutes." Tatsuma didn't answer. He'd learned, across a long career, that villains who monologued instead of fighting were usually either stalling or testing, and he had no intention of giving this one the satisfaction of either. He raised his hand, and the harbor's night air filled with the sudden, gathering pressure of water drawn up from the nearby docks, compressed into a spearing column, aimed with lethal precision at the center of Muzan's chest. The strike landed. Muzan did not attempt to dodge it, had in fact made the deliberate choice not to. Curious in the same clinical way he approached every new test whether this world's more forceful abilities carried any hidden mechanism his earlier, smaller-scale testing hadn't revealed. The water struck with enough concentrated force to have punched through reinforced concrete, and Muzan's body absorbed the impact with a visible ripple of displaced flesh before closing, within seconds, back to its original unmarked state. "Interesting," Muzan said, glancing down at his own chest with mild clinical curiosity, as though examining a minor inconvenience rather than an attack that had, by every measure Tatsuma's team could observe, simply failed. Considerable force, precisely applied, and entirely insufficient. Tatsuma's two subordinate heroes, a woman whose quirk let her generate short-lived duplicate copies of herself, and a younger man whose ability manifested as controlled electrical discharge, exchanged a single unspoken glance that carried the particular dread of professionals recognizing, in real time, that their carefully prepared response had just failed its first and most fundamental test. "Containment field," Tatsuma called, falling back on the second tier of his team's prepared protocol. Now, the tactical team behind him deployed a support item device Muzan hadn't previously encountered, a large humming apparatus that unfolded from a reinforced case and generated, within seconds, a visible barrier of shimmering, distorted air encircling the alley's full width. Designed, Muzan understood from the brief flare of specialized energy it emitted, to suppress and contain quirk-based abilities within its perimeter. He felt nothing from it. No suppression, no resistance, no sense of containment at all. The field simply failed to register his existence as the kind of thing it had been built to hold, exactly as every prior tool this world had thrown at him had failed in the same fundamental way. "You may want to reconsider your equipment budget," Muzan said, and moved. What followed was not, by any honest accounting, a fight. It was closer. Tatsuma would reflect much later in the report he filed with trembling hands, to watching an apex predator demonstrate, with patient and almost instructional clarity, exactly how thoroughly outmatched every tool his team had brought actually was. Muzan did not kill any of the 3 heroes who'd arrived with the rapid deployment unit, a restraint that cost him nothing, and served, he understood with characteristic calculation, the same purpose the earlier restraint with the young harbor patrol hero had served. A dead pro-hero of genuine regional standing would generate headlines, public outcry, the kind of galvanized institutional fury that accelerated resource allocation in ways Muzan still preferred to control the pace of. Wounded, thoroughly and unmistakably defeated heroes generated something almost as useful and considerably less politically volatile: fear. Precisely calibrated, delivered to an institution that would now have no choice but to understand, in concrete rather than theoretical terms, exactly what it was facing. He disabled the duplicate-generating hero first, his extensions finding her real body among 3 identical copies with an ease that suggested some manner of perception beyond ordinary sight. A detail that would occupy the Commission's threat analysts for weeks afterward, unable to determine how he'd distinguish the genuine target so unerringly. He met the electrical hero's discharge directly, absorbing a strike that would have stopped most opponents' hearts and continuing forward through it without so much as a change in his unhurried pace. He reached Tatsuma last, Closing the distance the veteran hero had spent his entire career learning to control, and ended the confrontation with a single, precisely calibrated strike that left the man alive, conscious, and utterly, comprehensively aware of exactly how far outside his experience this encounter had fallen. "Tell your commission," Muzan said, standing over the fallen commander with the same flat, unhurried calm he'd carried through the entire encounter, "that whatever category they've been attempting to file me under, they should abandon it. I am not a quirk. I am not a mutation. I am not anything your scientists will find comparable precedent for, however deeply they search their records." He paused, studying the man's pale, sweat-streaked face with something almost like genuine curiosity. "I would also advise them against sending more of you in the same configuration. It would be, at this point, a waste of resources. I suspect your organization can less afford than it believes." He walked away from the scene at the same unhurried pace he'd maintained throughout, disappearing into the harbor district's tangle of side streets before any secondary response team could arrive, leaving behind 3 wounded heroes, a failed containment field, and a piece of surveillance footage that would, within hours, become the single most closely analyzed piece of evidence in the Hero Public Safety Commission's history. The footage reached Aizawa's desk before dawn, forwarded through an emergency channel with a priority flag he'd never before seen attached to a commission communication. He watched it twice, in the gray pre-dawn quiet of his office, with the same flat, focused attention he brought to everything, and felt, by the second viewing, something he rarely permitted himself in the course of his professional duties: genuine, unmistakable alarm. He'd seen powerful villains before. He'd fought several himself, weathered engagements that had left him hospitalized more than once, across a long career defined as much by exhaustion and persistence as by any singular triumphant victory. But he had never seen anything move through a prepared tactical response. Water pressure calibrated to concrete shattering force, a containment field built specifically to suppress quirk-based ability, 3 genuinely capable regional heroes fighting in coordinated formation, with the sheer, unhurried indifference the footage showed. He called Tsukauchi before 6 in the morning, a violation of the detective's usual sleep schedule that Tsukauchi, watching the same footage moments after picking up, didn't so much as mention. "It's not testing anymore," Tsukauchi said, his voice carrying the particular grim weight of a man recalibrating months of careful investigative theory in real time. 5 months of quiet, careful movements, and now this. He wanted to be seen. He wanted us to see exactly what our best prepared response looked like against him. "Which means," Aizawa said, already pulling up the emergency contact list that would, within the hour, assemble every senior hero and commission official, this new footage's implications demanded. "He's decided he doesn't need to hide anymore. That's not a villain making a mistake, Tsukauchi. That's a villain who's concluded, after 5 months of careful observation, that hiding costs him more than it protects him." The full weight of that conclusion settled over the Commission's emergency session convened later that morning, with a gravity that exceeded even the special case designation's original urgency. Reiko Utsushimi, presiding once again, watched the footage in silence with the same senior board that had first authorized the escalation 5 months earlier, and when the recording finished, allowed a long moment of heavy silence to pass before speaking. "We need a new category," she said finally, addressing the room with the particular stark honesty of an administrator confronting the total failure of her institution's existing framework. Not special case, not unregistered anomaly. Something that acknowledges we are facing a threat our containment doctrine was never built to address, and that our best prepared response, 3 capable regional heroes, specialized suppression equipment, 5 months of theoretical preparation, failed against it in under 2 minutes. "What do you propose?" Godai asked, his earlier hopeful skepticism from the first briefing entirely gone now, replaced by something considerably more sober. Utsushimi was quiet for a moment, weighing a decision she clearly understood carried consequences well beyond this single room. I propose we stop treating this as a matter for regional agencies and mid-tier response teams, she said. I propose we bring this to the Commission's highest tactical review, with authority to consider resources we don't typically deploy against individual threats. Coordinated multi-agency response, top-tier pro-hero involvement, and a formal request to UA regarding whether any staff or affiliated hero possesses capability categories we haven't yet tried against this thing. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the particular weight of someone naming a fear the entire room had been circling without saying aloud. Because if our best conventional response failed this completely, I want to know, before this creature decides to test itself against something larger than a harbor district, exactly what in our arsenal, if anything, can actually slow it down. The footage from the harbor district did not stay contained within Commission channels for long. A piece of surveillance video showing 3 regional pro-heroes defeated in under 2 minutes by a single unclassifiable figure proved, in the particular way such things always eventually did, too significant to remain buried in an internal review. A junior analyst's careless forward, a leaked frame captured by a passing civilian's phone, before official channels sealed the scene, enough fragments reaching enough independent outlets that by the following evening, the story had broken publicly, in a form the Commission could no longer fully control. Unknown threat defeats Commission response team. Sources confirm special case designation active for 5 months. The headline, and the dozens like it that followed across every major outlet within 48 hours, generated exactly the kind of public alarm the Commission had spent 5 careful months trying to avoid provoking. Utsushimi found herself by the week's end, testifying before an emergency legislative oversight session, fielding questions from officials who wanted concrete answers about a threat her own department could offer only theories and forensic fragments to describe. We are treating this as our highest active priority, she told the assembled committee, her carefully measured public composure concealing the considerable strain 5 days of crisis management had placed on her. The Commission is coordinating with our most capable response resources, including preliminary consultation with UA's senior staff regarding specialized countermeasures. It was, in the strictest sense, true. It was also, Utsushimi understood better than anyone in that room, a description that papered over a genuinely uncomfortable truth. The Commission did not yet have a working strategy against this threat, beyond the accumulation of more resources thrown at a problem no one fully understood. The League of Villains learned of the Harbor District incident the same way most of the public did, through leaked footage and breathless news coverage. Though Tamura Shigaraki's reaction, watching the recording in the League's current hideout with Kurogiri standing quietly beside him, carried a considerably different quality than the Commission's alarm. "Chisaki's monster," Shigaraki said, watching Tatsuma fall for the 3rd time in the recording's brief runtime, his scratching hand pressed absently against his own throat in the restless habit Kurogiri had long since stopped commenting on. "He's the one Overhaul kept asking us about, kept saying might be recruitable." "It would appear," Kurogiri said, his tone carrying its usual formal composure, "that recruitment may no longer be a productive framing. Whatever this creature intends, it has demonstrated no evident interest in aligning with any faction. Not us, not the Shie Hasaikai, and certainly not the heroes it just humiliated." "Doesn't matter what it intends," Shigaraki said, something sharpening in his restless posture as he watched the footage a second time. "Matter is what it did. Beat a Commission tactical response like it wasn't even trying. That's not something we can afford to have running around uncontrolled while we're building toward—" He stopped himself, some fragment of caution surfacing even through his evident fascination, and Kurogiri, understanding the reference without needing it completed, said nothing further on the matter of whatever larger plans Shigaraki's restraint had briefly touched on. All for One will want to know about this, Kurogiri said instead. A power capable of defeating a coordinated hero response with such ease, one that apparently defies every conventional containment method. That is precisely the category of information he would consider essential. Shigaraki's hand stilled against his throat, something calculating entering his restless expression. Yeah, he said slowly. Yeah, he'll want to know. All for One received the report through the careful, layered channels that connected him to Shigaraki's operations, even in his current, deeply constrained circumstances. Channels that Shigaraki himself understood only partially, communicating with a mentor whose actual location and condition remained, by design, largely opaque even to his most trusted lieutenant. The report, when it reached him, received considerably more careful attention than most incoming intelligence, because All for One had spent decades cultivating a particular kind of patient, comprehensive curiosity about every genuinely unusual power that crossed his awareness. A curiosity that had, across that same span of decades, made him the single most dangerous collector of stolen ability this world had ever produced. He reviewed the footage twice, through means that need not concern the ordinary channels reporting to him, and arrived by the second viewing at a conclusion considerably more measured than either the Commission's alarm or Shigaraki's restless fascination. No Quirk signature, he noted, with the particular clinical attention of a man who had spent his entire existence cataloging the exact mechanics of ability. Regeneration exceeding any known healing type factor. Physical force sufficient to shatter concrete, absorbed without visible injury. A biological weapon deployed with precision, suggesting either extraordinary control or some manner of extended sensory perception beyond standard sight. He considered, with the same patient thoroughness that had governed his approach to every significant threat and opportunity across a very long life, what this creature might represent if its power could genuinely be taken, not merely observed, not merely theorized about, but transferred, the way every quirk he had ever encountered could, in principle, eventually be transferred, given sufficient contact and sufficient force. It was, he acknowledged privately, an open question whether his stealing ability would function against something that, by every indication in the footage, did not originate as a quirk at all. He had never encountered a power quite like this one, not a mutation, not an emitter type, not a transformation built on the genetic architecture every quirk in this world ultimately shared. If the creature's nature genuinely lay outside that architecture entirely, his own ability's fundamental mechanism might find, for the first time in his considerable experience, nothing to actually take hold of. That uncertainty did not trouble him the way it might have troubled a lesser mind. All for One had built his entire existence on turning uncertainty into leverage, patience into eventual advantage, and he filed the question away, not urgent, not yet requiring direct action, but marked, with the particular careful attention he reserved for genuinely significant variables, alongside his broader, longer-term calculations regarding the world's shifting balance of power. He sent, through the same layered channels, a single instruction back to Shigaraki. Do not engage it directly. Observe. Learn what you can of its patterns, its motivations, its actual limits, if any exist. A power this disruptive to the Commission's confidence is not, by itself, a threat to our own plans. It may, in time, prove considerably more useful as a complication for our enemies than as an obstacle to us. But I want to understand it before either of us decides what to do about it. Shigaraki, reading the instruction relayed through Kurogiri, felt something between disappointment and grudging acceptance settle over his restless ambition. He had wanted, in the raw, immediate way that governed so much of his temperament, to simply throw the League's resources at the problem, and see what happened. But he had learned, across his years under All for One's patient tutelage, that his mentor's caution had rarely proven wrong, and he filed the instruction away with the same reluctant discipline he applied to every lesson that conflicted with his own impatient instincts. Muzan, unaware of the specific attention now converging on him from three entirely separate directions, the Commission's mounting emergency response, the League's careful, mentor-directed observation, and somewhere beyond even that, the patient calculation of a man whose ambitions dwarfed even Shigaraki's, spent the days following the Harbor District confrontation exactly as he had spent every prior phase of his time in this world, watching, learning, and adjusting his understanding of the terrain now shifting rapidly around him. He had expected the public exposure. He had, in fact, deliberately chosen it, understanding that the era of quiet, careful anonymity had reached its natural limit, and that a controlled, decisive demonstration served his purposes better than continued patient hiding. What he had not fully anticipated, a rare admission in the private, honest corner of his mind where he examined his own miscalculations, was the sheer velocity of this world's public information systems, the speed with which a single incident in a coastal harbor district became, within days, a subject of national anxiety and legislative testimony. It was, he reflected, watching fragments of the coverage through a television in a small coastal cafe he'd taken to frequenting under yet another carefully constructed identity, a genuinely useful confirmation of something he'd suspected since his earliest weeks in this world. This society's fear, once triggered, moved with a speed and coordination his own previous world's fractured, secretive Demon Slayer core had never possessed. The core had hunted him for 1,000 years through patient, generational persistence, passing knowledge and purpose from teacher to student across centuries. This world's response, by contrast, had assembled itself, imperfect, uncoordinated, but genuinely alarmed, within a matter of days. That speed cut both ways. Muzan understood with characteristic clarity. It meant a faster-moving threat, resources converging on him with a rapidity his previous existence had never required him to counter. It also meant, if he read the underlying panic correctly, an institution more likely to overextend itself in visible, desperate escalation than to settle into the kind of patient, generational hunt he had spent 1,000 years learning to evade. He had, he decided, watching the news coverage continue its anxious churn, perhaps weeks rather than months before the Commission's mounting desperation produced something genuinely more dangerous than the Harbor District's failed tactical response. A larger deployment, more capable heroes, whatever specialized countermeasure their theoretical consultation with UA's staff eventually produced. He found himself turning the calculation over with the same patient discipline he brought to everything, not entirely opposed to that acceleration. He had spent 5 months learning this world's shape from its edges and its shadows. The confrontation building now, whatever form it eventually took, would teach him considerably more about its true limits, and about his own place within it, than another 5 months of careful, patient observation ever could. Let them assemble their best response, he thought, finishing the last of a coffee he had no genuine need to drink, maintained only as part of the unremarkable human routine his current identity required. I have waited 1,000 years to stop being the hunted thing. I find I have very little patience remaining for waiting through this world's version of the same tired arrangement. The specialized countermeasure the Commission eventually assembled did not come from a laboratory or a support item developer, though both contributed pieces to what followed. It came, in its final and most consequential form, from a decision made in a closed-door meeting between Reiko Utsushimi and Principal Nezu, a decision that would, in the weeks ahead, pull UA's students considerably closer to this crisis than Nezu had hoped to allow when he'd first drawn the line at staff-only briefings 5 months earlier. I've exhausted conventional options, Utsushimi told him, seated across from his small, characteristically composed form in his private office, her own composure fraying at its edges after 2 weeks of legislative testimony and mounting public pressure. Suppression fields fail against it. Physical force, however concentrated, fails against it. Eraserhead's own Quirk remains untested directly. Aizawa hasn't had a confirmed opportunity to attempt erasure against this thing, and given what happened to Tatsuma's team, I'm not eager to send him in alone to find out. You're considering sending him in with support then, Nezu said, already following the logic to its likely conclusion. I'm considering, Utsushimi said carefully, assembling the single most capable coordinated response this commission can currently produce, built around confirming, once and for all, whether erasure genuinely has no effect on this creature's abilities. Because if it doesn't, we need to know that clearly enough to stop wasting resources hoping otherwise. And if it does, even partially, that becomes the single most valuable piece of information we currently lack. Nezu was quiet for a long moment, his bright eyes considering the proposal with the particular multi-layered calculation that made him, despite his small stature, one of the most formidable strategic minds in the hero profession. You want All Might's successor's team involved, he said finally, not quite a question. I want every genuinely capable senior hero this school and this commission can responsibly field, Utsushimi said. I'm not asking to deploy students, Nezu. I understand the line you drew 5 months ago, and I respect it. But I would be lying if I said this creature's continued freedom didn't represent a growing risk to everyone this school exists to eventually protect, students included. The longer this goes unresolved, the more likely it becomes that this crisis reaches your campus on its own terms rather than ours. Nezu folded his small paws together, considering the genuine weight of that argument against his own careful institutional caution, and arrived, after a long moment, at a decision that would set the following week's events in motion. Aizawa, he said. Present Mike, for coordination and communication support given the scale you're describing. And I want Recovery Girl on standby regardless of how this engagement unfolds. Whatever happens, I want our people walking away from it alive, even if the outcome isn't the clean resolution you're hoping for. He paused, something more somber entering his bright, analytical gaze. And Utsushimi, I want it clearly understood, going into this, that if erasure proves as ineffective as our other tools have, we are not simply going to escalate to greater and greater force indefinitely. At some point, if nothing in our current arsenal can genuinely counter this creature, the correct response becomes containment of the damage it can do, not a doomed pursuit of victory over something we may simply lack the tools to defeat. The engagement, when it finally came, unfolded 3 weeks later, in a manner that satisfied almost no one involved, not the commission, whose careful coordination produced results considerably more ambiguous than the decisive confirmation Utsushimi had hoped for, not Aizawa, whose own direct test of erasure against Muzan yielded an answer that troubled him considerably more than a clean failure would have, and not Muzan himself, who found the encounter, for the first time since his arrival in this world, genuinely difficult to fully predict in advance. He had allowed himself to be found, not carelessly, but deliberately, understanding that the commission's mounting desperation would eventually locate him regardless of his own precautions, and preferring, with characteristic calculation, to meet that confrontation on ground and terms he'd had some hand in choosing, rather than continue an indefinite game of evasion that offered diminishing returns. He selected, for this purpose, an abandoned industrial district on his coastal city's outskirts. Enough open space to observe an approaching force clearly, enough structure to provide cover if the engagement required it, and critically, enough distance from genuine civilian population that whatever unfolded would not force him into the kind of collateral restraint that had shaped his conduct in the harbor district. Aizawa arrived first, alone, in a calculated tactical decision the Commission's planning team had debated at length before authorizing. A single hero, uncommitted to a larger formation, approaching close enough to attempt erasure directly, while a considerably larger support force held position at a careful remove, ready to engage only if the initial test produced actionable results. "You're the one they call Eraserhead," Muzan said, watching the lean, exhausted-looking hero approach across the industrial district's cracked concrete, genuine interest coloring his otherwise flat, patient voice. "I've observed you once before, from a distance. An efficient ability. I've been curious, since that first observation, whether it would function against me at all." "Then let's find out," Aizawa said, and his eyes flared their characteristic red capture weapon, already unwinding from around his neck in a fluid, practiced motion. What followed, in the several seconds that mattered most, was neither the clean failure the Commission had feared, nor the clean success Aizawa had hoped for. And it was this genuine ambiguity, more than any decisive outcome, that would occupy the Commission's analysts for weeks afterward. Aizawa's erasure, by its fundamental mechanism, suppressed the biological signal a quirk generated in order to manifest, a specific, identifiable neurological pattern his own ability had evolved to recognize and interrupt. Muzan's regeneration, his biological weaponry, his hypnotic influence, all of it operated on a substrate that generated no such signal at all, and against these core aspects of his nature, Aizawa's stare accomplished precisely nothing, exactly as 5 months of accumulated evidence had already suggested it would. But there was, buried within Muzan's otherwise seamless capability, one narrow and genuinely unexpected exception, a small residual thread of borrowed power, absorbed across 1,000 years, from the very few demons whose blood he had ever permitted himself to consume, rather than simply command. And among that thin, inherited collection, a single ability that had originated, however distantly and improbably, from a source closer in nature to what this world would recognize as a genetic mutation, than to his own ancient, blood-forged core. It was minor, a subtle enhancement to his perceptive range, the very capability that had allowed him to distinguish the duplicate hero's real body from her copies in the harbor district. And it flickered, for a fraction of a second under the direct focus of Aizawa's red-eyed stare, before resuming without any meaningful interruption to Muzan's overall capability. But it flickered, and Aizawa, watching with the trained, exhausted precision of a hero who had spent his career learning to read the smallest tells in an opponent's ability, saw it happen. "There," he said, more to himself than to Muzan, something sharpening in his tired expression, something in their response. Not much, but something. Muzan's own reaction to the discovery carried a complexity he rarely permitted himself to show openly. Not alarm, precisely, but a genuine, unhurried recalibration, the particular attention of a mind confirming that even his considerable nature carried threads he hadn't fully accounted for in this new world's terms. "A small mercy for your commission, then," Muzan said, his voice betraying nothing beyond its usual flat calm, though the private, calculating part of his mind filed the discovery away with genuine seriousness. "A single thread, among a great many, that your ability can apparently touch. I'd advise you not to overstate its usefulness. It changes very little about what I remain capable of." "Maybe not," Aizawa said, already backing carefully toward the position where his support force waited, his mind working through the implications with the same rapid, practical calculation that had kept him alive across a demanding career. "But it changes something. And something's more than we had an hour ago." He did not press the advantage further, a calculated withdrawal rather than a retreat. the tactical restraint of a hero who understood he'd gathered exactly the piece of information this engagement had been designed to produce, and had no interest in risking more than necessary, confirming a victory the numbers didn't actually support. Muzan, for his part, allowed the withdrawal without pursuit, watching Aizawa retreat toward the waiting support force with the same patient, unhurried calculation he'd shown throughout the brief exchange. A single thread, he thought, turning the discovery over with genuine, careful attention as the industrial district's evening settled around him, Aizawa's distant retreating form fading into the gathering dark. Minor, inherited, not native, but a thread nonetheless. The first genuine crack this world has found in 5 months of trying. It did not frighten him. Muzan Kibutsuji had not experienced genuine fear in longer than he could clearly remember, and a single minor vulnerability, confirmed and now understood, represented information to be managed, rather than a threat to be feared. But it sharpened, considerably, his private calculation regarding exactly how much longer he intended to continue engaging this world's heroes on the patient, exploratory terms he'd maintained thus far. And it sharpened, too, an uncomfortable awareness that a world clever enough to find even this small a crack in his nature might, given sufficient time and sufficient desperation, eventually find others. He would need, he understood with characteristic clarity, to decide soon exactly what he actually wanted from this world, not merely to survive within it, not merely to test and confirm his own considerable capability against it, but something more deliberate, more permanent. The question had been circling the edges of his patient calculation for weeks now, and the industrial district's brief, inconclusive confrontation had, if nothing else, finally forced it toward the center of his attention. What is it, precisely, that I intend to become in this place? It was not a question Muzan Kibutsuji had permitted himself to ask directly in a very long time. Aizawa's report reached the Commission's Tactical Review Board within hours, and its contents, a confirmed, if minor, vulnerability in an otherwise impenetrable threat, produced a reaction considerably more consequential than the modest scale of the discovery seemed to warrant. Reiko Utsushimi, presenting the findings to an emergency session that now included, for the first time, representatives from the Commission's most senior tactical planning division, watched the room's mood shift from the exhausted resignation that had settled over the previous month's failures into something sharper, more purposeful. "It's small," she told them, careful not to overstate a discovery she understood carried real limits. Eraserhead's own assessment is that this vulnerability affects a minor fraction of the creature's total capability, some inherited element distinct from its core nature, whatever that core nature actually is. It does not represent a path to neutralizing the threat outright. "But it's a confirmed weakness," said the Tactical Division's senior representative, a severe man named Kobori, whose entire career had been built on turning theoretical advantages into operational plans, which means this creature is not, in fact, entirely beyond our ability to affect. That changes the calculus considerably. If erasure can suppress even a fraction of its capability, a sustained, coordinated engagement, erasure paired with concentrated force, rather than force alone, may produce results our previous attempts simply weren't structured to achieve. It was, Utsushimi understood, watching the room's energy sharpen around Kobori's proposal, precisely the kind of institutional momentum she had both hoped for and quietly dreaded in equal measure. A path forward, finally, after months of failure, but one that carried its own considerable risk of overconfidence, built on a discovery whose actual significance remained, by Aizawa's own careful assessment, genuinely uncertain. "I want this planned with extreme caution," she said, cutting through the room's gathering enthusiasm with the particular firmness of an administrator who had learned, across 5 difficult months, exactly how costly institutional overconfidence against this threat could prove. Not a full engagement built around an assumption this minor vulnerability scales to something exploitable. A careful, incremental test. Aizawa again, with additional support this time, structured specifically to determine whether sustained erasure produces any cumulative effect, or whether what we saw in the industrial district was simply the full extent of what's available to us. Kobori's expression suggested he considered this excessive caution, but he nodded regardless, understanding the political reality that Utsushimi's continued authority over the special case response remained, for now, the operative constraint on how aggressively the Commission could move. Kai Chisaki learned of the industrial district engagement and its inconclusive but genuinely significant outcome through channels that had, in the months since Muzan's departure from their arrangement, grown considerably more strained but not entirely severed. A testament, Chisaki privately acknowledged, to just how thoroughly his organization's underworld reach still exceeded the Commission's official investigative resources, even months into a joint task force specifically built to dismantle it. He absorbed the report with the same clinical attention he brought to every piece of intelligence, and felt, reading through the details of Aizawa's confirmed vulnerability, something he hadn't experienced in the 4 months since Muzan's final, unambiguous refusal of his extraction proposal. Genuine, renewed hope. A crack, he thought, seated alone in his immaculate office, turning the report's implications over with mounting, carefully controlled excitement. Small, inherited, not native, according to Eraserhead's own assessment, which means it originates from some biological source, distinct from whatever core nature the creature actually possesses. If that source can be identified, isolated, understood, he caught himself before the thought fully completed, recognizing in his own gathering enthusiasm the exact pattern of ambition that had, 4 months earlier, provoked the single most direct and unambiguous threat Muzan had ever delivered against him. He had not forgotten that warning. He had, if anything, spent the intervening months forced restraint nursing a grievance against it. The particular resentment of a man convinced his own genuine talent had been dismissed rather than properly evaluated. But a confirmed vulnerability changed the calculation, he told himself, turning the justification over with the same meticulous precision he applied to every decision. Not extraction from Muzan directly. That avenue remained, he understood clearly, as closed and dangerous as it had ever been. But if the vulnerable element truly originated from some inherited non-native source, as Aizawa's assessment suggested, then perhaps that source itself, whatever demonic lineage or absorbed capability had produced it, might be studied, understood, even replicated through other means entirely, means that never required Muzan's cooperation or awareness at all. It was, Chisaki acknowledged in the private, honest corner of his own considerable ambition, a thin thread of justification stretched over what remained, at its core, the same forbidden ambition Muzan had already warned him against pursuing in any form. But 4 months of enforced patience, 4 months of watching the creature that had once needed his cover become instead a figure the entire nation now openly feared and hunted, had worn that warning's original weight down to something Chisaki found himself, against his own better judgment, increasingly willing to test the actual limits of. He summoned Rappa and Tengai that same evening, and began, with the same careful, methodical precision that had built his organization across 15 years, to assemble a plan considerably more dangerous than anything he had previously attempted. One that would, in the weeks ahead, force a confrontation none of the parties now circling Muzan Kibutsuji had fully anticipated arriving on this particular timeline. Muzan, unaware of the specific ambition now quietly reassembling itself in Chisaki's immaculate office, spent the days following the industrial district engagement engaged in his own careful reassessment, not of his physical capability, which the confirmed vulnerability had done little to meaningfully diminish, but of the deeper question the confrontation had finally forced to the center of his attention. What is it, precisely, that I intend to become in this place? He turned the question over during the long, quiet hours of yet another temporary identity, watching the evening settle over a small apartment 3 districts from the industrial site where Aizawa had found his single narrow crack, and arrived, across several days of unhurried consideration, at a conclusion that surprised him rather less than perhaps it should have. He had spent 1,000 years in his previous world pursuing a singular ambition, the conquest of sunlight, the final erasure of the one true limitation that had defined every choice he'd made since the night a dying man's desperate treatment had first transformed him into something the world had no name for. That ambition had shaped everything: his patience, his cruelty, his careful accumulation of power across a millennium of consumption and adaptation. And that ambition, he understood now with genuine, unhurried clarity, no longer applied here. This world's sun posed him no threat at all. He had confirmed as much in his very first careless days here, standing in ordinary daylight with nothing more than mild surprise at his own continued existence. He was, for the first time in longer than he could clearly recall, a creature without the single defining purpose that had organized his entire existence. It left in the considerable space that purpose's absence created, a question he found himself circling with genuine, unfamiliar uncertainty. Not how do I survive this world? A question he had already answered thoroughly across 5 months of patient testing and confirmation. But what, precisely, does survival in a world with nothing left to fear actually mean? He thought of the Commission's mounting, increasingly desperate response, the Harbor District's failed tactical unit, the Industrial District's narrow, inconclusive vulnerability, the gathering institutional momentum he understood, with characteristic clarity, would only continue to accelerate now that they'd found something, however small, to build a strategy around. He thought of Chisaki's ambition, quiet now but never, he suspected, genuinely extinguished. He thought of the League of Villains, restless and building toward some larger confrontation he understood only in careful, second-hand fragments, and of the man called All for One, whose actual capabilities remained, even now, a genuine and unresolved unknown. A world without a sun to fear. Muzan understood with the particular slow, cold clarity of a mind finally arriving at a conclusion it had been circling for weeks, was not a world without purpose. It was, simply, a world offering him the freedom to choose a new one, and he found himself turning the possibility over with genuine, unhurried interest, increasingly drawn toward an ambition he had never once permitted himself to seriously entertain, in 1,000 years of hiding from hunters, considerably more numerous and more coordinated than anything this world's commission had yet managed to assemble. Not survival, not merely testing what this world's limits are. Dominion. He did not decide, in that quiet apartment on that particular evening, exactly what form that ambition would eventually take, or how swiftly he intended to pursue it. He understood enough of his own patient nature to know that such decisions required careful, unhurried development, rather than sudden resolution. But the question that had occupied him since the industrial district's brief, inconclusive confrontation had at last found its answer, and Muzan Kibutsuji permitted himself, watching the last light fade from his apartment window, something he had not genuinely felt in a very long time: anticipation. Chisaki's plan, when he finally presented its full shape to Rappa and Tengai 3 days later, carried a specificity that told both enforcers, even in their limited understanding of the science involved, exactly how much careful thought their boss had already invested in it. The vulnerability Eraserhead found isn't native to the creature, Chisaki explained, standing before a whiteboard covered in his own precise, cramped handwriting. diagrams of biological pathways, notations on absorption and inheritance that neither Rappa nor Tengai fully followed but recognized, from long experience, as the product of genuine expertise rather than desperate guesswork. Which means somewhere, at some point in whatever existence it lived before arriving here, it consumed or absorbed capability from another source. A source closer to what we'd recognize as biological inheritance than whatever core nature the creature itself actually runs on. If I can identify enough about the nature of that absorption process, even without the creature's direct cooperation, there's a real possibility I can replicate a fraction of what makes it so resistant to everything else in our arsenal. And how exactly do we get that information without asking him? Tengai said, arms crossed, his gravel voice carrying its usual flat skepticism toward ambitious plans that hadn't yet survived contact with reality. We don't need him, Chisaki said. We need someone who's had direct, sustained proximity to him. Ideally, someone he's fed from, or someone he's used his abilities on extensively enough that biological trace evidence might remain. He paused, something calculating entering his expression. According to my sources, there's an underbelt fixer, one of the original crew from the basement where he first arrived, who's remained in periodic contact with him ever since, the one everyone still calls Sabu. If the creature has used any of his more subtle abilities near this man repeatedly over the past several months, there's a genuine chance we could extract usable biological data without ever needing to approach the creature directly at all. It was, Chisaki understood even as he outlined it, a plan built on inference stacked upon inference. Aizawa's assessment of the vulnerability's likely origin, Chisaki's own theoretical understanding of biological inheritance mapped onto a creature whose fundamental nature remained, in truth, almost entirely unknown to him. But it was, crucially, a plan that required no direct confrontation with Muzan himself, no repetition of the warning he'd already delivered once with unmistakable finality. And that distinction, Chisaki had convinced himself across 4 months of careful, resentful patience, made all the difference. Sabu had spent the 8 months since that first terrible night in the basement building, a life defined almost entirely by fear. Fear of the man in white who periodically resurfaced to extract information or simply confirm his continued, useful silence. And fear, growing steadily since the Harbor District footage broke, of exactly what kind of thing he'd been quietly serving all this time. He did not see the Shie Hasaikai enforcers who took him from his apartment on a rain-soaked Tuesday night until they were already inside, and by the time he understood what was actually happening, not another visit from the man in white, but something considerably more mundane and, in its own way, more immediately terrifying. Rappa had already secured his hands, and Tengai had already begun the careful, methodical work of explaining exactly what Chisaki's organization needed from him. "We just need to know what he's done to you," Tengai said, his gravel voice carrying an almost clinical detachment that Sabu found, in its own way, considerably more unsettling than open threat. How often, what it felt like, whether there's ever been direct blood contact, and if so, how recently. Sabu, trembling in the corner of his own ransacked apartment, understood with sudden, horrified clarity that he had just become, without any choice of his own, a genuine point of danger between two of the most frightening entities operating in this city, and that whatever he said in the next several minutes carried consequences he had no way of properly weighing. "He's used the influence thing," Sabu said, the words tumbling out in the desperate, overfast rhythm of a man trying to buy his own safety through cooperation. "The eyes. Makes you agree to things you wouldn't normally agree to. Done it to me maybe a dozen times since he first showed up. Never blood, though. He's never actually fed from me, I don't think. I'd remember that, wouldn't I?" "You'd remember," Tengai confirmed, though something in his flat tone suggested this answer disappointed the plan's actual requirements more than it satisfied them. It was at this precise moment, Sabu trembling in his own apartment's corner, Tengai relaying the unsatisfactory findings back toward Chisaki through a secured channel, Rappa standing watch by the door with his usual restless impatience, that the apartment's single window shattered inward, and Muzan Kibutsuji stepped through the wreckage with an expression that carried, for the first time since Chisaki had known him, something closer to genuine and unrestrained anger than the flat, patient calm he'd maintained through every previous encounter. "I gave your organization a clear warning," Muzan said, his voice carrying none of its usual unhurried patience, the molten quality of his eyes intensifying in a way that made even Rappa's usual eager confidence falter. "I told Chisaki, in terms I believed left no room for creative reinterpretation, precisely what would happen if he pursued this ambition regardless. And yet here I find his people, in this man's home, attempting exactly the extraction he assured me he had abandoned." "We weren't," Tengai started, some instinct for self-preservation overriding his usual gravel-voiced steadiness. "We weren't going after you directly. Just gathering information from someone else. Nothing that touched you at all. You believe that distinction matters to me," Muzan said, and the flat, cold certainty in his voice carried more genuine menace than any raised threat could have managed. "It does not. I told your employer that I would not permit myself to be studied, replicated, or reduced into something extractable. Whether that study happens through my own body, or through the careful interrogation of someone I've allowed to continue living, is, to my understanding of the warning I delivered, an entirely irrelevant distinction." Rappa, recovering some of his usual bravado in the face of a threat he'd never actually seen Muzan act on directly, shifted his stance toward something more combative. "So what? You gonna do to us what you did to that tactical team? Boss send us in, knowing that was a risk. We're not scared of—" He did not finish the sentence. Muzan crossed the distance between them with the same unhurried, impossible speed that had ended a dozen prior confrontations, and Rappa found himself, within a fraction of a second, pinned against the apartment's ruined wall with a grip around his throat that made every ounce of his considerable physical strength feel suddenly, comprehensively irrelevant. "I am not interested in killing either of you tonight," Muzan said, his voice dropping to something quieter and, in its quietness, considerably more frightening than any shout. "Not because I lack the inclination, but because your deaths would accomplish less than what I intend instead." He released Rappa, who slumped against the wall gasping, and turned his attention to Tengai, still frozen by the shattered window. "You will return to Chisaki. You will tell him, precisely and without softening, that this is the final warning he receives from me. The next time his ambition brings his people near anyone I have any use for, near anyone connected to me in any capacity, I will not visit his enforcers. I will visit him directly, and I will not extend him the courtesy of a conversation first." He looked, then, toward Sabu, still huddled and trembling in the corner, and something in his expression shifted. Not warmth. Muzan Kibutsuji possessed nothing resembling genuine warmth toward any creature in either world he had inhabited, but a kind of proprietary, almost territorial regard that made the underlying message unmistakable, even without further explanation. "You," he said to Sabu, "have served a purpose. That purpose has value to me still. I would prefer it remain intact." He glanced back toward Tengai. "Tell your boss that his continued survival, and the survival of his organization, currently depends on his understanding that some things in this city belong to considerations he is not equipped to interfere with. I would advise him to find that understanding quickly." He left the way he'd entered, through the shattered window, into the rain-soaked evening beyond, leaving Rappa still catching his breath against the wall, and Tengai standing frozen with the particular stillness of a man who had just watched, with total clarity, exactly how thin the margin of safety his organization had been operating on for the past 8 months genuinely was. Chisaki received the report that same night, and sat for a long while in his immaculate office afterward in a silence considerably heavier than his usual controlled composure typically allowed to show. He had, across 15 years of building his organization into one of the region's most feared criminal powers, rarely encountered a threat that genuinely, unambiguously exceeded his own careful calculations of risk and reward. He understood now, with a clarity that cost him something to fully accept, that he had spent 4 months systematically underestimating exactly how absolute Muzan's warning had actually been. He did not immediately abandon his broader ambition. Some fundamental core of Chisaki's character resisted the total abandonment of any project he'd invested genuine thought into, and the theoretical question of what made Muzan's nature resistant to this world's tools remained, in the private, curious corner of his mind, genuinely unresolved. But he understood, turning the night's events over with the same meticulous attention he brought to every calculation, that the direct approach had reached its absolute limit, and that any future pursuit of that curiosity would require patience, considerably more extreme than anything he had shown thus far. Patience measured, perhaps, in years rather than months, pursued through means so indirect that Muzan himself might never connect them back to their true origin. It was, Chisaki acknowledged to himself in the quiet aftermath of a night that had come closer to costing him everything than any single encounter in his 15-year career, a lesson in exactly how far his own ambition had begun to outpace his usually reliable judgment. He did not know, sitting alone in his immaculate office with the city's rain-soaked lights visible beyond his window, that this particular lesson would prove, within a matter of weeks, to be one of the very last considerations he had the freedom to weigh, because the Commission's own mounting investigation into his organization, running in careful parallel to every event of this long and complicated night, had finally, after months of patient work, assembled enough evidence to move. The raid on the Shie Hasaikai's false clinic came 11 days after Muzan's confrontation with Rappa and Tengai, a timing Tsukauchi's task force had settled on independent of any awareness of that night's events, built instead from months of patient evidentiary work finally reaching the threshold a magistrate would authorize as sufficient for a full tactical operation. The Commission committed considerable resources to the operation, drawing on the same senior tactical planning that had, weeks earlier, produced the industrial district's careful test of Aizawa's erasure against Muzan, a decision Utsushimi authorized personally. Understanding that an organization capable of producing intelligence sophisticated enough to have once maintained a working arrangement with the nation's single most dangerous unclassified threat deserved to be dismantled with genuine seriousness, rather than treated as a routine criminal matter. Aizawa led the primary breach team, backed by a coordinated force of pro-heroes and Commission tactical units that descended on the shuttered clinic's service elevator in the pre-dawn hours with the practiced, overwhelming precision of an operation months in the planning. Chisaki, alerted with barely enough warning to matter by the same informant network that had, until recently, kept him ahead of exactly this kind of development, understood within seconds of the first alarm that the careful, patient empire he'd spent 15 years constructing had finally, irrevocably run out of time. "Get everyone to the secondary exit," he told Rappa and Tengai, already moving toward the vault where his most sensitive research remained stored, the particular controlled calm he brought to every crisis fraying at its edges into something closer to genuine desperation. "Whatever happens, that research does not fall into Commission hands." It did not go entirely to plan. The Commission's breach team, moving with the coordinated speed of an operation that had studied the clinic's likely layout for months, reached the vault level faster than Chisaki's own escape route accounted for. Then the confrontation that followed, Chisaki's remaining loyal enforcers against Aizawa's team, fought through corridors and stairwells with the desperate intensity of men who understood exactly what capture would mean, left the underground complex considerably more damaged than either side had intended by the time it concluded. Chisaki himself was taken alive, cornered in his own vault by Aizawa's direct pursuit. His Quirk's considerable capability for disassembly and reconstruction ultimately proving insufficient against a hero who understood, from months of study, exactly how to close distance under Eraser's suppression before Chisaki could bring his full ability to bear. Rappa fought until he could no longer stand, taken into custody with the particular bitter satisfaction of a man who'd at least gone down fighting rather than fleeing. Tengai escaped through the clinic's secondary exit with a handful of surviving loyalists, vanishing into the city's underworld with the particular grim understanding that the organization he'd served for years no longer meaningfully existed. The news reached Muzan through fragments, public reporting on the raid's broad strokes, supplemented by the considerably more detailed picture his own remaining underworld contacts pieced together over the following days. He absorbed it with an attention that carried, beneath its usual patient calm, something closer to genuine interest than he'd expected the news to provoke. Chisaki's organization, dismantled in a single coordinated night. The man himself, taken alive and now, by every account Muzan could gather, held in some manner of specialized commission detention, designed for precisely the kind of dangerous, unusual ability his Quirk represented. It was, Muzan reflected, seated in the quiet of his current identity's modest apartment, a genuinely useful confirmation of something he'd suspected since his very first week studying this world's institutional machinery. The commission, for all its bureaucratic sluggishness, possessed a genuine and considerable capacity for coordinated, decisive action once its patience finally exhausted itself. Chisaki had spent 15 years believing his organization's careful insulation from official scrutiny made it functionally untouchable. That belief had proven, in the end, no more accurate than his belief that Muzan's nature might eventually be studied and reduced through sufficiently clever indirect means. He found himself, turning the development over with characteristic patience, uncertain whether Chisaki's fall represented a genuine loss to his own careful positioning in this world, or simply the removal of a complication whose value had, in truth, already been largely exhausted months earlier. Chisaki's cover had proven useful in his earliest, most vulnerable weeks in this world. It had proven, more recently, a liability whose continued existence had nearly cost Sabu's life, and had required Muzan to expend genuine, direct effort, delivering a warning he would have preferred not to need to deliver at all. One fewer variable to account for, he concluded, with the particular cold pragmatism that had governed his relationships across 1,000 years of similarly transactional arrangements. Though I suspect the Commission's confidence, following a victory this significant, will require correcting before it grows into something genuinely inconvenient. That correction, he understood with characteristic clarity, would need to come soon. The Commission had spent 5.5 months building, through accumulated failure and hard-won incremental discovery, a genuine institutional momentum against him. Aizawa's confirmed vulnerability, now this decisive dismantling of an organization connected, however distantly, to his own early movements in this world. Left uncorrected, that momentum would only continue compounding, each small victory feeding the confidence required to authorize the next, larger escalation. He had spent 5.5 months, Muzan reflected, watching the evening settle over his current apartment's modest window, allowing this world to learn his shape at a pace largely of his own patient choosing. The question that had occupied him since the industrial district's inconclusive confrontation, what is it, precisely, that I intend to become in this place, had, in the weeks since, resolved itself into something considerably closer to genuine intention than the vague, circling curiosity it had first arrived as. Dominion required, he understood with characteristic clarity, more than mere survival, more than the accumulation of confirmed capability against an institution's best-prepared responses. It required, eventually, a demonstration significant enough that this world's fractured power structures, its commission, its licensed heroes, its villains and yakuza, and whatever deeper, more dangerous ambitions men like All for One nursed in careful secrecy, understood, beyond any remaining doubt, precisely what had entered their world, and precisely what it now intended to claim. He did not yet know the shape that demonstration would take, but he understood, with the particular patient clarity of a mind that had spent 1,000 years learning exactly when patience needed to yield to decisive action, that the moment for choosing that shape had, at last, genuinely arrived. In a commissioned detention facility built to hold precisely the kind of dangerous, unusual capability Kai Chisaki represented, the man himself sat in a cell designed around his Quirk-specific mechanics, gloves that prevented direct hand contact, a chamber that limited his range of motion, every precaution the commission specialists could devise against a man whose ability made ordinary containment considerably more complicated than most. He had said very little since his capture, offering none of the cooperation his interrogators had hoped a fallen crime boss facing decades of confinement might eventually provide. He spent his hours instead in the same patient, methodical calculation he'd applied to every problem across 15 years of careful ambition, turning over, again and again, the considerable knowledge he'd accumulated about the creature whose fall had, in an indirect but unmistakable way, precipitated his own. He warned me, Chisaki thought, seated in his sterile cell with the particular stillness of a man who had, for the first time in a long career defined by his own agency, lost every meaningful measure of control over his circumstances. Warned me clearly, more than once, and I chose ambition over the warning regardless. He did not know, sitting in that quiet cell with nothing but his own careful thoughts for company, that the commission's interrogators, working through the considerable file his capture had generated, had already begun to understand, from the fragments of research seized in his vault, considerably more about the nature of the unclassified threat that had once briefly sheltered under his organization's protection than Muzan Kibutsuji would have preferred any human institution to ever piece together. Somewhere in that seized research, buried among Chisaki's careful notes on inheritance and biological absorption, lay the first genuine thread the commission's scientists would need to begin, however slowly, however incompletely, constructing something Muzan had not yet fully accounted for in his patient calculation of this world's actual limits, a working theory, however partial, of what he actually was. The seized research took the Commission's specialized science division 3 weeks to properly process. A team of 6 analysts working under strict compartmentalized secrecy, cross-referencing Chisaki's meticulous notes against every fragment of forensic data the Commission had accumulated since the very first basement killings nearly 6 months earlier. What emerged from that work was not, by any measure, a complete understanding of Muzan Kibutsuji's true nature, but it was, Utsushimi understood upon receiving the final briefing, considerably more than the Commission had possessed at any prior point in this long, difficult pursuit. "He's not native to any framework we understand," the lead analyst told the assembled tactical review board, a careful woman named Dr. Emi Sarashina, whose entire career had been built on exactly this kind of painstaking forensic reconstruction. Chisaki's notes theorize, based on the pattern of the one confirmed vulnerability Eraserhead identified, that whatever this creature's core nature actually is, it's accumulated additional capability over what appears to be a very long period of time, absorbed, rather than inherited through any birth process our biology would recognize. The vulnerable thread Eraserhead found isn't a weakness in his fundamental nature, it's residue, something borrowed, imperfectly integrated, from an external source. Can that be exploited further? Kobori asked, leaning forward with the particular sharp attention that had defined his contribution to every tactical session since the industrial district's discovery. Theoretically, Sarashina said, with the careful hedging of a scientist unwilling to overstate incomplete findings. If the creature has accumulated multiple such absorbed elements across whatever time span produced it, there may be more than one thread like the one Eraserhead found, each individually minor, but potentially, if enough were identified and targeted simultaneously, cumulative in a way that could meaningfully affect its overall capability. I want to stress this is theoretical. We have one confirmed data point. Building an operational strategy around an unproven extrapolation from a single data point is exactly the kind of overconfidence that got Tatsuma's team hospitalized. Utsushimi absorbed the briefing with the particular careful weight of an administrator who understood, better than anyone else in that room, exactly how much institutional pressure now bore down on producing a decisive resolution to a crisis that had, over 6 months, cost the Commission enormously in public confidence, resources and, in the case of Tatsuma's team and the Harbor District's wounded, genuine human cost. I want a full mobilization plan built around this theory, she said finally. But I want it built with Sarashina's caution built into every stage. Aizawa leads, as before. But this time, I want him supported by every hero we can responsibly field with abilities that might target whatever additional absorbed elements exist. Mental influence countermeasures, given what we know of his apparent hypnotic capability. Specialized restraint developed from what we've learned about his regeneration. Anything Sarashina's team can theorize might interact with the threads Chisaki's research suggests exist. She looked around the room, weighing the gravity of what she was about to authorize. This is the largest coordinated response this commission has assembled against a single individual threat since the profession's modern founding. I want it to work. And I want every person involved to understand, going in, that it may not. Muzan learned of the Commission's Science Division's work considerably later than he would have preferred. A gap in his information network that Chisaki's fall had created, and that he had not yet fully rebuilt in the weeks since. It was, in fact, only the visible signs of an unusually large, coordinated hero deployment converging on his current coastal region, patrol patterns shifting, unfamiliar heroes appearing in numbers that suggested something considerably beyond routine coverage, that first alerted him to the fact that something significant had changed in the Commission's approach. He understood, watching these preparations assemble themselves over several careful days of observation, that the moment he had been anticipating since Chisaki's capture had finally arrived, not on his own chosen timeline, but forced now by an institution whose patient accumulation of knowledge had finally produced whatever theoretical advantage it believed justified this scale of commitment. He did not flee. He had considered, across the preceding weeks of careful deliberation, exactly this possibility. A commission emboldened by Chisaki's research, mobilizing at a scale beyond anything he'd previously faced, and had concluded, with the same patient clarity that had governed every major decision since his arrival, that flight now would accomplish considerably less than confrontation, deliberately chosen and met on his own terms as fully as circumstances allowed. He had spent 6 months learning this world's shape. He understood, with genuine and considerable confidence, precisely what advantage the Commission believed it had found, and precisely how far that advantage was likely to actually extend against the overwhelming majority of his true capability. A handful of absorbed inherited threads, vulnerable, yes, targetable in theory, represented, against the vast bulk of his own ancient blood-forged nature, a genuinely minor concern. Let them come with their full understanding, incomplete as it remains, he thought. standing at the window of his current apartment and watching the gathering signs of an approaching confrontation with something that had, over the preceding weeks, settled into genuine and unhurried anticipation. I have waited long enough, watched long enough, tested enough of this world's limits to understand precisely what I am capable of claiming from it. Let this be the moment that understanding becomes undeniable. To them, and to whatever deeper ambitions still watch and calculate from beyond their reach. He thought, in that quiet moment before the gathering storm finally broke, of the question that had occupied him since the industrial district's inconclusive test. What is it, precisely, that I intend to become in this place? He understood now, with the particular cold clarity of a mind that had spent 1,000 years learning patience and had finally, in this new and unfamiliar world, decided the time for patience had reached its natural limit, precisely what answer he intended to give, not through further careful words, further patient positioning, further incremental testing of a world that had already, 6 months into his presence, demonstrated the outer boundary of what it could genuinely do to threaten him. He intended to give that answer through action, deliberate and unmistakable, in the confrontation now gathering itself beyond his window, and whatever emerged from that reckoning, Muzan Kibutsuji understood, would determine considerably more than his own continued existence in this world. It would determine, for heroes and villains alike, exactly what kind of world this had now, irreversibly, become. The confrontation that followed, the largest coordinated hero response in the Commission's modern history, built around a single theoretical advantage and a great deal of hard-won institutional resolve, would not, in the end, produce the clean resolution either side had hoped for. It would produce instead something closer to the truth of what this world had learned, across 6 long months, about the nature of the thing that had fallen through a black market rift into its midst, that Muzan Kibutsuji could be wounded, however narrowly, that he could be studied, however incompletely, that an institution built on classification and control had, through patience and cost and genuine sacrifice, finally found the outer edge of something it could not simply file away and forget. It would not produce his defeat, nor would it produce his uncontested triumph. What it would produce, in the weeks and months following that reckoning, was something considerably more unsettling to a society built on the comforting certainty of clear categories, an uneasy, watchful equilibrium, a predator who had tested his new world's every limit and found most of them wanting, and an institution that had learned, at enormous cost, that some threats could not be neutralized so much as endured, studied, and, with whatever caution remained available, prepared for. Somewhere beyond the reach of both the Commission's careful science and Muzan's own patient calculation, a man who could steal any power he touched continued watching, still uncertain whether his own considerable ability would find anything to take hold of in a creature that had never once, in 1,000 years, belonged to the world it now claimed to understand. And in a quiet coastal apartment, in whatever face he chose to wear next, Muzan Kibutsuji continued his long, patient study of a world that had given him something no century of his previous existence ever had. Not merely survival, not merely the absence of a single fatal weakness, but the genuine, dawning possibility of dominion, earned this time not through fear of a son he no longer needed to escape, but through the deliberate, unhurried choice of a creature who had finally decided, after 1,000 years of running, that this was a world worth staying to rule.